The Great Migration. How the African American Exodus Changed America. Chapter 1. The Roots of the Great Migration. The Great Migration was shaped by centuries of racial oppression and economic hardship faced by African Americans in the South. Following the Civil War, the promise of freedom and equality was met with harsh reality as Jim Crow laws institutionalized racial segregation. These laws restricted African Americans' access to education, healthcare, and economic opportunities, creating a cycle of poverty and disenfranchisement. As the years went on, many felt trapped in a system designed to keep them from advancing. Economic conditions in the South were another driving factor. The agricultural economy was largely based on sharecropping, a system that kept African Americans in a state of economic dependence. Many sharecroppers were unable to escape debt and had little opportunity for upward mobility. With limited access to jobs in other industries, African Americans saw little hope for a better future in the South. The rise of industrialization in the North created new opportunities that were unattainable in the South. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit saw the growth of factories and other industries that needed labor. These urban centers promised better pay, improved living conditions, and freedom from racial segregation. However, the promise of the North was often exaggerated, with many migrants arriving to find crowded neighborhoods and tough working conditions. Racial violence and discrimination were also pervasive in the South, prompting many African Americans to seek refuge in the North. Lynching and other forms of racial terror were common, especially in rural areas. The fear of violence, coupled with a lack of justice for victims, made the South a dangerous place for African Americans to live. This fear, alongside the desire for a safer environment, pushed many to leave their homes in search of a better life. The migration was not an isolated event, but rather part of a larger trend of African American resistance to systemic racism. African Americans in the South began to realize that their efforts to change the system through education, legal means, and protest were often met with violence or indifference. This led many to believe that the best path to freedom and opportunity was to leave the oppressive environment behind. Religious leaders, social activists, and community organizers played an important role in encouraging the migration. Churches were central to African American communities, and many religious leaders spoke out about the need for change. They helped to provide both the moral and logistical support necessary for the migration, offering resources and guidance to those who chose to leave the South. The decision to migrate was not an easy one. Leaving behind family, friends, and the familiar was difficult, especially for those who had deep roots in their communities. However, the desire for freedom, economic stability, and safety ultimately outweighed the fear of the unknown. As more and more African Americans chose to leave, the Great Migration began to take shape, ultimately changing the landscape of America. The history of African American life in the South. African American life in the South was shaped by the legacy of slavery and the racial hierarchies that existed long after the Civil War. Even after emancipation, African Americans were subjected to harsh discrimination and limited opportunities. The Black Codes, laws designed to restrict the freedom of African Americans, were put in place after the Civil War, ensuring that former slaves would remain in a subordinate position. Sharecropping became a dominant system, binding African Americans to the land in near indentured servitude with little chance of economic mobility. Despite the harsh conditions, African Americans in the South built strong communities. They created churches, schools, and social institutions that helped them survive and maintain their culture. The church played a central role in these communities, serving as a space for spiritual nourishment, social gatherings, and political organizing. These institutions were critical in providing support and a sense of unity, even as the larger society remained hostile. The segregation that took root in the South during the Reconstruction era further reinforced the division between African Americans and white society. African Americans were denied access to many public services, including schools, transportation, and even basic accommodations. The institution of Jim Crow laws in the late 19th century codified racial segregation, making it difficult for African Americans to break free from the system of oppression. These laws limited their economic, political, and social opportunities, effectively trapping them in cycles of poverty and discrimination. Economic opportunities for African Americans in the South were scarce, and many turned to agriculture to survive. Sharecropping, though not the same as slavery, kept many African American families in debt to landowners. This system, combined with low wages and poor working conditions, meant that even the most hardworking individuals had little chance of improving their circumstances. The lack of industrialization in the South compared to the North meant that there were few jobs beyond agriculture, and those who sought better opportunities often found themselves stuck in a system of exploitation. The rise of racial segregation. Racial segregation in the United States became widespread after the Civil War, particularly in the South, where laws and social practices reinforced a rigid divide between African Americans and whites. Following the end of slavery, Southern states passed black codes to control the newly freed African American population and restrict their rights. These codes aimed to limit mobility, employment, and access to education for African Americans, setting the stage for formal segregation. The intent was to maintain white supremacy and prevent African Americans from gaining any real economic or political power. The system of segregation evolved into what would become known as Jim Crow laws, named after a racist minstrel character. These laws were enacted in Southern states in the late 19th century and remained in effect until the mid-20th century. Jim Crow laws mandated the separation of African Americans and whites in all public facilities, including schools, transportation, and housing. African Americans were forced to use separate, often inferior facilities, and they were excluded from many public spaces altogether. The rise of segregation was also supported by social and cultural practices that reinforced racial inequality. Social customs, such as separate entrances for black and white people, created an atmosphere where African Americans were constantly reminded of their supposed inferiority. Interracial marriage was criminalized, and African Americans were expected to know their place in the social hierarchy, with severe consequences for defying these unwritten rules. This cultural climate made segregation a deeply ingrained part of Southern life. The Supreme Court's ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 solidified segregation by legalizing the doctrine of separate but equal. This decision declared that racial segregation was not unconstitutional, as long as the separate facilities provided for African Americans were deemed equal to those provided for whites. In reality, the facilities and services for African Americans were almost always subpar, further entrenching the disparities between the races. The Plessy decision paved the way for decades of institutionalized segregation. Segregation was not just a legal framework, it became a defining characteristic of everyday life in the South. African Americans faced discrimination in nearly every aspect of life, from education and employment to housing and voting rights. In schools, black children received inferior education compared to white children, often in dilapidated, overcrowded classrooms. African Americans were restricted to low-paying, menial jobs and were denied opportunities to advance economically or socially. In addition to the formal segregation laws, racial violence and intimidation were used to maintain the system of racial separation. Lynchings, beatings, and other forms of violence were common tools for enforcing white supremacy. African Americans who challenged segregation or tried to assert their rights risked facing brutal retaliation. This environment of fear and violence served as a constant reminder that racial segregation was enforced not just through laws, but through terror. The rise of segregation in the South had lasting effects on the African American community. It created deep economic, social, and psychological divides that would take generations to heal. African Americans were denied opportunities for full participation in American society, and the legacy of segregation would continue to affect future generations. Despite this, African Americans persisted, building strong communities and developing strategies of resistance that would later fuel the civil rights movement. Economic hardships and discrimination. After the Civil War, African Americans in the South faced severe economic hardships that were compounded by discriminatory laws and practices. Most African Americans, especially former slaves, had little access to land or capital, leaving them dependent on sharecropping or low-paying labor. Sharecropping often trapped them in debt to landowners, making it nearly impossible to break free from poverty. This economic system effectively replaced slavery for many African Americans, maintaining their subjugation under a new name. Discrimination in the labor market further hindered African Americans' economic opportunities. Employers often refused to hire African Americans for skilled positions, relegating them to menial and unskilled labor. Even when African Americans were employed, they were paid significantly lower wages than their white counterparts. In industries such as agriculture, construction, and domestic work, the pay was often insufficient to support a family, and job stability was minimal. African Americans were also restricted in terms of access to education, which further limited their economic mobility. Most Southern states passed laws that prohibited or severely restricted the education of African American children. Without access to quality education, African Americans were often relegated to low-paying, unskilled jobs. The lack of educational opportunities reinforced the cycle of poverty, making it difficult for African Americans to improve their economic standing. In addition to the lack of educational opportunities, the South's economy was largely agrarian and relied on racial hierarchies to maintain control over labor. African Americans were excluded from most higher-paying occupations in industry and commerce, which were often reserved for whites. The lack of industrial jobs in the South meant that many African Americans, especially in rural areas, had few alternatives but to work the land, where opportunities for advancement were minimal. This created a system that perpetuated economic inequality for generations. Discriminatory practices also extended to African Americans' ability to acquire property. Laws and social customs made it difficult for African Americans to purchase land or secure loans for business ventures. In many cases, white landowners and businesses used their economic power to prevent African Americans from owning land or participating in the local economy. This systemic exclusion from property ownership limited their ability to accumulate wealth and pass it down to future generations. Racial discrimination in housing also played a significant role in the economic hardships faced by African Americans. Even when African Americans had steady jobs or some financial stability, they often found themselves excluded from better neighborhoods or housing options. Redlining, a practice where banks and insurance companies refused to provide services to African American communities, limited the opportunities for homeownership and wealth accumulation. The result was a continued concentration of poverty in African American neighborhoods. Despite these immense challenges, African Americans found ways to survive and build strong communities. They created informal economies, relying on family and mutual aid networks to meet basic needs. African American entrepreneurs, although faced with numerous obstacles, established businesses in their communities, providing goods and services that were often unavailable elsewhere. These acts of resistance, in the face of economic hardship, laid the groundwork for future movements aimed at achieving racial and economic equality. Chapter 2: The Early Waves of Migration. The first wave of the Great Migration began around the turn of the 20th century as African Americans started to leave the South in search of better opportunities. Economic hardship, racial discrimination, and the oppressive conditions in the South pushed many African Americans to look northward. The promise of higher wages, better working conditions, and the possibility of escaping Jim Crow laws motivated thousands to make the difficult journey. This migration was not only about escaping poverty, but also about seeking a new life free from the constant fear of racial violence and discrimination. Many African Americans left for cities in the North, such as Chicago, New York, and Detroit. These cities, growing rapidly due to industrialization, offered job opportunities in factories, transportation, and other industries that were not available in the South. African Americans were drawn by the possibility of earning better wages, improving their living conditions, and having access to better schools and health care. However, upon arrival, they often found that life in the North was not as perfect as they had imagined. In the North, African Americans still faced racial prejudice, but it was often less overt and institutionalized than in the South. While they were not subjected to Jim Crow laws, discrimination was rampant in housing, employment, and public accommodations. African Americans found themselves in crowded neighborhoods with limited resources and faced challenges in finding decent housing. Despite these difficulties, northern cities offered African Americans more freedom and opportunities to organize and build stronger communities. The impact of World War I on the migration cannot be overstated. The war created a labor shortage in northern factories, which increased demand for workers. Many African Americans saw this as an opportunity to escape the stagnant agricultural economy of the South and take up the open jobs in the North. The promise of steady work and better wages led to a surge in migration, particularly in the years between 1915 and 1920. This period marked the beginning of what would become a large-scale shift of African American populations out of the South. As African Americans moved north, they were also looking for a place to escape the violence and racial terror that was common in the South. Lynching and other forms of racial violence were widespread in the southern states, and the absence of legal protections for African Americans made them vulnerable. The constant threat of violence made living in the South unbearable for many. In the North, while prejudice still existed, African Americans could at least expect a degree of protection under the law, giving them a sense of security that was not available in the South. The migration also had an impact on African American culture. As they settled in northern cities, African Americans brought their customs, traditions, and music with them, which began to shape the cultural landscape of these urban centers. The influence of Southern music, such as blues and jazz, helped to fuel a cultural renaissance in cities like Harlem, where African American artists, musicians, and writers began to flourish. The migration sparked a sense of pride and solidarity among African Americans, as they began to assert their identity in ways that had been impossible in the South. The early waves of migration set the stage for a larger movement that would take place in the decades to come. The migration began to transform both the African American experience and the cultural landscape of America. As more African Americans left the South, they not only sought better economic opportunities, but also contributed to the growing cultural, social, and political influence of African Americans in the North. The early migration was a turning point, marking the beginning of a shift that would reshape the future of African American life in the United States. Factors driving the exodus. The primary factor driving the exodus of African Americans from the South was the promise of better economic opportunities in the North. The South, with its limited industrial development, relied heavily on agriculture, which offered few opportunities for upward mobility. Most African Americans in the South were trapped in sharecropping or low-wage jobs that kept them in poverty. The industrialized cities in the North offered better wages and a wider range of job opportunities, particularly in factories, steel mills, and transportation industries. Racial discrimination and the oppressive social structure in the South also played a significant role in motivating the migration. Jim Crow laws enforced segregation and denied African Americans basic rights and freedoms. Violence and intimidation, particularly lynching, were common forms of racial control, and the South was a dangerous place for those who defied the social order. Many African Americans sought to escape the constant threat of violence, looking for safer environments where they could live without fear. The failure of Reconstruction and the rise of white supremacy further fueled the exodus. After the end of the Civil War, African Americans were hopeful for social, political, and economic equality. However, the promises of Reconstruction were largely unfulfilled as Southern states passed restrictive laws and policies that marginalized African Americans. The resurgence of white supremacy in the late 19th century made life unbearable for many, pushing them to seek a new life in the North. The economic decline of the South also pushed African Americans to leave in search of better prospects. The agricultural economy was struggling, particularly after natural disasters like floods and crop failures. The boll weevil infestation in the early 20th century devastated cotton crops, one of the South's main sources of income. These economic hardships made it increasingly difficult for African Americans to survive in the South and motivated them to seek new opportunities elsewhere. World War I was another major factor that accelerated the migration. The war created a labor shortage in the North, as many men enlisted in the military. Factories and industrial plants urgently needed workers, and Northern employers actively recruited African Americans to fill these jobs. The war's demand for labor provided African Americans with an immediate opportunity to leave the South and find stable, higher-paying jobs in the North. The growing influence of the African American press also played a role in spreading news about opportunities in the North. Newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Crisis published stories about the benefits of Northern migration and helped to build awareness among African Americans in the South. These publications not only highlighted the economic opportunities, but also described the social and political freedom available in the North, encouraging more people to make the move. Finally, the promise of better education and improved living conditions in the North was an important motivator. In the South, African Americans faced limited access to education, with many schools underfunded and overcrowded. In the North, educational opportunities were more accessible, and families hoped to provide their children with better futures. The desire for greater social mobility and a better quality of life in general was a powerful motivator for African Americans to leave the South and pursue new opportunities in the North. The movement to northern cities. As the Great Migration gained momentum, African Americans began to move in significant numbers from the South to northern cities in search of better opportunities. Cities like Chicago, New York, Detroit, and Philadelphia became popular destinations due to their industrial growth and the promise of better wages. These urban centers were thriving with job openings in factories, steel mills, and manufacturing plants, which contrasted sharply with the limited agricultural work available in the South. The movement northward was a direct response to the economic challenges and lack of opportunities that characterized the South during the early 20th century. The migration was not without its difficulties, as many African Americans faced hardships upon arriving in the North. Although they sought freedom from Jim Crow laws, they were not free from racial prejudice. Northern cities still had racial tensions, with African Americans often confined to overcrowded neighborhoods with poor living conditions. They encountered discrimination in housing and employment, and many had to settle in areas with subpar services, despite the promise of better living conditions. One of the primary reasons for the shift to northern cities was the promise of better-paying jobs. In the South, most African Americans worked as sharecroppers or laborers with little chance for advancement. Northern cities offered a variety of industrial jobs that paid significantly more than agricultural work, even though the work itself was often grueling and dangerous. African Americans were drawn to the idea of earning higher wages that could support their families and provide a higher standard of living. The migration was also spurred by the demand for labor created by World War I. As many white workers enlisted in the military, northern factories needed laborers to replace them. This opened up opportunities for African Americans, who were actively recruited by northern employers. The wartime labor shortage led to an influx of African American migrants seeking to fill these jobs, further driving the migration to northern cities. In many cases, African Americans had to navigate a complex and unfamiliar urban environment once they arrived. They often relied on the support of family members, friends, and people from their communities who had already made the move. These social networks provided guidance, housing, and employment leads, which were vital for newcomers as they tried to settle into city life. The shared experiences of migration helped to form strong community bonds among African Americans in the North. The migration to northern cities also had a profound impact on African American culture and social life. As African Americans settled in urban centers, they brought with them a rich cultural heritage rooted in Southern traditions, including music, food, and religious practices. This cultural exchange helped to shape the cultural fabric of northern cities, especially in places like Harlem, where the Harlem Renaissance blossomed. The migration facilitated the growth of a distinct urban African American culture that would influence art, literature, and music across the nation. While northern cities offered new opportunities, they also presented new challenges. African Americans often found themselves competing with other minority groups for housing and jobs, which could lead to tensions between different communities. Despite these obstacles, the migration to northern cities marked a major turning point for African Americans, who began to build new lives in urban environments. The move north not only transformed the lives of individual migrants, but also had lasting effects on the social, cultural, and political landscape of America. The role of World War I in accelerating migration. World War I played a significant role in accelerating the Great Migration, as it created an urgent demand for labor in northern factories and industrial centers. As millions of white men enlisted in the military, the northern workforce was depleted, and industries needed to fill the labor gap. African Americans in the South saw this as an opportunity to escape the economic hardships of sharecropping and low-wage agricultural labor. The war effort led to an increase in job openings in manufacturing and steel mills, which attracted thousands of African Americans to northern cities. Northern employers, eager to maintain production levels during the war, began actively recruiting African American workers from the South. They placed advertisements in African American newspapers, such as the Chicago Defender, encouraging migrants to move north for better wages and job security. The promise of steady work, higher wages, and the chance to escape the oppressive conditions of the South made the migration to northern cities highly appealing. Many African Americans were drawn to cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York, where factories and industrial plants were booming due to the war. The labor shortage in the North also provided African Americans with an opportunity to improve their economic status. In the South, African Americans were largely limited to agricultural work, which kept them in poverty and indebtedness through systems like sharecropping. In the North, they found work in factories, meatpacking plants, and transportation sectors, often earning wages that were far higher than what they could make in the South. This financial independence allowed them to support their families and establish a better standard of living. While World War I offered economic opportunities in the North, it also led to increased racial tensions. African American migrants arrived in cities where job competition was fierce, and they often faced discrimination in housing and employment. White workers, particularly those who had been displaced by the war, viewed the influx of African Americans as a threat to their jobs. This led to clashes and racial violence in some northern cities, highlighting the persistent racial divide that African Americans faced, even in the supposedly more progressive North. Despite the challenges, the migration during World War I marked a shift in African American social and political life. The influx of African Americans into northern cities brought together diverse communities that had been scattered across the rural South. These new urban environments allowed African Americans to build stronger political, cultural, and social institutions. The war helped to foster a sense of unity and shared purpose among African American migrants, which would later fuel the civil rights movements of the 20th century. The migration also had cultural implications, particularly in the development of the Harlem Renaissance. As African Americans settled in northern cities like New York, they brought with them rich cultural traditions, including music, literature, and art. The Harlem Renaissance, which began in the 1920s, was a direct result of the migration and provided a platform for African American artists, writers, and musicians to express their experiences and challenge racial stereotypes. The cultural shift was one of the most significant outcomes of the migration, reshaping African American identity and influencing American culture as a whole. World War I not only accelerated the Great Migration, but also set the stage for future waves of African American migration to the North. The economic opportunities provided by the war, coupled with the desire for social and political freedom, convinced many African Americans that their futures lay beyond the South. The war acted as a catalyst for a larger shift in the African American experience, one that would reshape the demographic, economic, and cultural landscape of the United States for generations to come. Chapter 3: Life in the Northern Cities. The arrival in northern cities brought a mix of hope and hardship for African American migrants. Many had left behind poverty and violence in the South, expecting a better life in the North. While they did find higher wages and more job opportunities, they quickly discovered that life in the cities came with its own set of challenges. Crowded neighborhoods, racial discrimination, and limited access to quality housing were common issues they faced. Housing was one of the most immediate concerns for new arrivals. With so many migrants moving to the same cities, Black neighborhoods grew rapidly and often became overcrowded. Landlords exploited the demand by charging high rents for substandard living conditions. Many African American families were forced to live in cramped apartments, with multiple households sharing small spaces, often lacking proper sanitation and maintenance. Despite the difficult housing situation, African Americans worked hard to create strong communities. Churches, mutual aid societies, and social clubs became vital parts of urban life, offering support and a sense of belonging. These institutions not only helped newcomers adjust to city life, but also played a crucial role in fostering pride and solidarity. In time, these communities began to thrive, building schools, businesses, and cultural centers that became sources of identity and strength. Employment opportunities were more varied than in the South, but African Americans were often limited to the least desirable jobs. They were frequently given the most physically demanding or dangerous positions in factories, steel mills, and slaughterhouses. Even in the North, white workers and labor unions sometimes resisted integration, making it difficult for Black workers to advance. Still, the pay was generally better than in the South, and many African Americans were able to save money, send their children to school, and enjoy small improvements in their standard of living. Racial tension remained a constant reality in northern cities. While not governed by Jim Crow laws, these cities were far from free of racism. African Americans were often segregated into specific neighborhoods and schools, and they faced discrimination in public services and employment. Racial violence sometimes erupted, especially when white residents feared Black competition for jobs or housing. Despite these obstacles, African Americans continued to push for equal rights and fair treatment. Education became a major priority for African American families in the North. Access to better schools was one of the key reasons many parents had decided to move. Northern public schools, while still unequal in many cases, offered more resources and opportunities than schools in the South. Families made great sacrifices to ensure their children could attend and succeed, hoping education would lead to a better future. Over time, African American culture flourished in the cities, leaving a lasting impact on American society. Music, literature, and art began to reflect the experiences of Black urban life, eventually gaining national recognition. The Harlem Renaissance, which emerged from these urban communities, became a symbol of Black creativity and resilience. Life in the northern cities was not without struggle, but it offered African Americans a new platform to express themselves, build communities, and fight for a better life. Economic opportunities in the North. The economic opportunities in the North were one of the biggest draws for African Americans during the Great Migration. Northern cities were experiencing rapid industrial growth, creating a high demand for labor. Factories, steel mills, and railroads needed workers to keep up with production, especially during and after World War I. African Americans saw these jobs as a path to escape the economic limitations they faced in the South. For many, the chance to earn a steady wage was life-changing. Unlike in the South, where they were often paid in credit or crops through the sharecropping system, Northern jobs paid in cash. This income gave African American workers a new sense of independence and allowed them to begin saving and providing for their families in ways that had not been possible before. Though the work was often exhausting and dangerous, it was seen as a step forward. Despite the availability of work, African Americans were usually restricted to the lowest-paying, most physically demanding jobs. They worked in foundries, meatpacking plants, textile mills, and as porters or janitors. Discrimination in hiring was widespread, and many unions refused to admit black workers. Advancement was difficult, and most were stuck in the same roles for years, regardless of their skill or experience. Still, the income they received from these jobs often surpassed anything they could have made in the South. This economic improvement allowed African American families to afford better housing, even if conditions were still far from ideal. They could also invest in their children's education, contribute to community institutions, and begin to build financial stability. These improvements were modest but meaningful steps toward long-term progress. In addition to factory work, some African Americans managed to open small businesses that served their growing communities. Barbershops, grocery stores, beauty salons, and cafes began to appear in black neighborhoods. These businesses not only provided goods and services, but also created jobs and helped build a sense of self-reliance. Economic success in these ventures was difficult, but possible, and some individuals became prominent figures in their local areas. Women also found new roles in the urban workforce. In the South, many black women worked as domestic servants for white families, often under harsh conditions. In the North, while domestic work was still common, some women found employment in factories, laundries, and even offices. This shift allowed them to contribute financially and gain more control over their lives, expanding their roles within their families and communities. Over time, the accumulation of wages and small business earnings allowed some African Americans to achieve a modest middle-class lifestyle. Though progress was slow and hard-won, the migration north opened doors that had long been closed. Economic opportunity was not evenly distributed, and racism continued to limit advancement, but the North gave many black families the chance to dream bigger than they ever could in the South. Challenges of urban living. Life in the northern cities came with its own set of harsh realities for African American migrants. Although they had escaped the deep oppression of the South, they were met with overcrowded neighborhoods and a shortage of adequate housing. Landlords frequently overcharged for poorly maintained apartments, forcing many families to live in cramped and unsanitary conditions. The rapid influx of people into these urban areas placed a huge strain on city infrastructure. Racial discrimination remained a constant barrier, even outside the Jim Crow laws of the South. African Americans found themselves segregated into specific neighborhoods through informal but powerful housing policies and social practices. Redlining and restrictive covenants kept black families from moving into better areas. This segregation often meant fewer public services, worse schools, and limited access to quality health care. Employment, while more available than in the South, was far from equal. African Americans were frequently given the lowest-paying, most physically demanding jobs. Many employers refused to hire them for skilled positions, regardless of qualifications. Even when jobs were secured, opportunities for advancement were rare, and black workers often faced hostility from coworkers and supervisors. Tensions also rose between African American migrants and white residents of northern cities. The arrival of large numbers of black families was sometimes seen as a threat to existing communities, particularly in the job and housing markets. These tensions occasionally erupted into violence, as seen in the race riots in cities like Chicago in 1919. The migrants, who had hoped for a more welcoming environment, instead found themselves struggling against new forms of prejudice. Public transportation, sanitation, and health services in black neighborhoods were often neglected. Overcrowding led to the spread of diseases and made it difficult to maintain cleanliness. Garbage collection and street maintenance were rarely prioritized in these communities. Residents had to rely on their own efforts and community networks to address basic needs that city services ignored. Despite these difficulties, African Americans continued to push for better living conditions and equal treatment. They formed neighborhood associations, advocated for political representation, and worked together to improve their communities. Churches, newspapers, and civic organizations helped spread awareness and build solidarity. Their activism laid the groundwork for the civil rights struggles that would follow in later decades. The challenges of urban living were a stark reminder that racism was not confined to the South. While the North offered new opportunities, it also presented new obstacles that African Americans had to overcome. The determination to build a better life in the face of adversity became a defining feature of the migrant experience. Though the road was difficult, the urban struggle also forged strong, resilient communities that would play a crucial role in shaping the future. The development of African American communities. As African Americans settled in northern cities, they began to build strong, tightly knit communities that provided support and a sense of belonging. These communities were often formed in the face of discrimination and segregation, which pushed black families into specific neighborhoods. Despite being marginalized, residents worked hard to create spaces where they could thrive and feel safe. These neighborhoods became the foundation for social, cultural, and political life for African Americans in the North. Churches played a central role in community development. They were not only places of worship, but also centers of education, social services, and civil rights activity. Ministers often served as community leaders and helped organize efforts to support struggling families and address local issues. Through church programs, residents found help with housing, employment, and childcare, creating a strong network of mutual support. Education was a major focus within these communities, and parents prioritized sending their children to school. Northern public schools, while still unequal in some areas, offered more resources than those in the South. African American families saw education as the key to upward mobility and a way to secure a better future for the next generation. Community leaders also worked to establish private schools and vocational programs where possible. Black-owned businesses began to flourish as residents sought to support their own. Barbershops, restaurants, corner stores, and tailors served not only economic purposes but also functioned as social gathering spots. These businesses created jobs and helped keep money circulating within the community. Over time, some entrepreneurs became successful enough to invest in property, start newspapers, and influence local politics. Cultural expression was another defining feature of these communities. Music, theater, literature, and art all found fertile ground in black neighborhoods. This cultural energy eventually led to the Harlem Renaissance and similar movements in other cities. These artistic expressions allowed African Americans to tell their stories, challenge stereotypes, and build pride in their heritage. Political organization grew alongside social and economic development. African Americans began to form voting blocs, support candidates who represented their interests, and challenge unfair housing and labor practices. Civic clubs and advocacy groups played a vital role in pushing for reforms at the local level. These early efforts at political engagement set the stage for larger civil rights battles to come. The development of African American communities in the North was a powerful response to the discrimination and hardship migrants faced. By building strong institutions, supporting one another, and preserving cultural identity, they laid the groundwork for future progress. These communities were more than places to live. They were hubs of resilience, innovation, and hope in the ongoing struggle for equality. Chapter 4: Cultural Shifts and the Harlem Renaissance. The Great Migration brought not only economic and demographic changes, but also significant cultural shifts. As African Americans moved to urban centers, especially in the North, they brought with them rich traditions of music, storytelling, and spirituality. In the cities, these traditions began to blend with new influences and experiences, leading to a cultural awakening. This transformation gave rise to a sense of pride and identity that would reshape American culture. One of the most vibrant expressions of this cultural movement took place in Harlem, a neighborhood in New York City. Harlem quickly became a hub for African American artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals. People from all over the country were drawn there by the energy and opportunity to share their talents. It was in this setting that the Harlem Renaissance was born, sparking a new era of Black creativity. Writers such as Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston captured the struggles and joys of African American life through poetry, fiction, and essays. Their work reflected themes of resilience, racial pride, and the search for identity in a changing world. These voices gained recognition beyond the Black community and challenged mainstream portrayals of African Americans. Literature became a tool for both self-expression and social critique. Music played an equally powerful role during this time. Jazz, which had roots in New Orleans and the South, found a new home in the North, evolving into a national phenomenon. Musicians like Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Bessie Smith performed in clubs and concert halls, influencing audiences across racial lines. Jazz and blues gave voice to the complexities of Black life and became symbols of freedom and innovation. Visual artists and performers also made their mark during the Harlem Renaissance. Painters and sculptors depicted Black subjects with dignity and strength, offering alternatives to the dehumanizing images often seen in popular media. Theaters showcased plays written and performed by African Americans, providing opportunities for representation on stage. Art became a way to reclaim narratives and assert cultural autonomy. This cultural flowering was not limited to Harlem. Cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. also saw the growth of Black arts and intellectual life. Each city contributed to the broader movement, creating a network of cultural exchange and mutual inspiration. These developments helped build a national sense of African American identity rooted in creativity, resilience, and shared experience. The Harlem Renaissance and the broader cultural shifts of the era had a lasting impact on American society. They laid the groundwork for future civil rights activism and reshaped how African Americans were seen and saw themselves. The movement demonstrated the power of culture to inspire change and unite a people. Through art, music, and literature, African Americans claimed their place in the national story with pride and determination. The emergence of Harlem as a cultural hub. Harlem emerged as a cultural hub during the early 20th century, largely due to the influx of African American migrants seeking better lives in the North. Originally a white middle-class neighborhood, Harlem transformed as Black families moved in, filling apartments and converting the area into a bustling center of Black life. The neighborhood's density and energy created the perfect environment for cultural exchange and collaboration. Harlem quickly became more than just a place to live. It became a symbol of possibility and pride. With the arrival of artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers, Harlem developed into the heart of Black creativity. People brought their talents and ideas from all over the country, forming a tight-knit artistic community. Cafes, salons, and theaters hosted regular gatherings where intellectual discussions flourished. This atmosphere of creativity allowed for the growth of new voices and new forms of expression that reflected the African American experience. One key factor in Harlem's rise was the presence of Black-owned businesses and institutions that supported the arts. Bookstores, newspapers, record labels, and publishing houses gave artists a platform to share their work. Entrepreneurs and patrons within the community invested in cultural development, creating a sustainable environment for artists. This support system empowered African Americans to tell their own stories on their own terms. Music was one of the most visible and influential aspects of Harlem's cultural scene. Jazz and blues clubs lit up the streets at night, drawing diverse audiences eager to hear the new sounds. Venues like the Cotton Club and the Apollo Theater became legendary for showcasing top talent. These spaces allowed Black musicians to thrive, even though many still faced segregation and racism outside the stage lights. Literature also thrived in Harlem, with writers using their work to explore themes of identity, racism, love, and resistance. Poets like Langston Hughes and Claude McKay used vivid language to capture the emotions and realities of Black life. Their words inspired pride and helped foster a sense of unity among African Americans. These literary voices became essential in shaping public understanding of the Black experience. Visual art and performance flourished alongside music and literature. Painters and sculptors captured everyday moments and celebrated Black beauty in ways rarely seen before in mainstream art. Theater groups performed plays that reflected Black struggles and triumphs, often drawing on African American folklore and history. Together, these art forms created a powerful cultural narrative that countered negative stereotypes. Harlem's emergence as a cultural hub changed the way African Americans saw themselves and how others saw them. It showed that Black culture was not only rich and diverse, but also essential to the American story. The legacy of Harlem's artistic and intellectual explosion continues to influence generations of creators. It remains a powerful example of how community, creativity, and resilience can reshape culture and inspire change. The birth of African American art and music. The early 20th century saw the emergence of African American art and music as defining forces in American culture. These creative expressions were deeply rooted in the lived experiences of Black communities and reflected their joys, struggles, and hopes. The Great Migration played a key role in this cultural birth, as it brought diverse talents together in northern cities. Urban life offered a new stage for Black voices to be heard, and many artists found inspiration in the everyday scenes around them. Jazz and blues became the musical language of the African American experience during this era. Originating in the South, these genres evolved in the North, where they gained national and even international popularity. Musicians like Louis Armstrong and Bessie Smith pushed the boundaries of sound, combining emotion, rhythm, and storytelling. Their performances gave voice to the soul of a people navigating both hardship and resilience. The popularity of jazz and blues helped break down racial barriers, as audiences of all backgrounds came to appreciate their power. Although many venues remained segregated, the music itself crossed boundaries and brought people together. Radio and records allowed these sounds to spread far beyond the clubs of Harlem and Chicago. As a result, African American musicians became some of the first Black public figures admired on a large scale. Visual art also flourished during this period, as African American painters, illustrators, and sculptors began creating works that reflected their identity and heritage. Artists portrayed scenes of Black life with dignity and beauty, challenging the stereotypical and often demeaning images that were widespread in the media. Their work celebrated culture, family, labor, and spirituality, offering a more complete and honest view of the African American experience. This artistic movement was about more than just beauty; it was a statement of existence and pride. African American artists claimed space in a world that often ignored or devalued them. By expressing their truths through paint, clay, and ink, they reshaped the cultural landscape. Their work helped foster a sense of unity and purpose within Black communities and inspired future generations to pursue creative paths. Collaboration and community played key roles in the birth of this artistic awakening. Musicians and artists often supported one another, sharing ideas and spaces where they could grow together. Black newspapers and magazines showcased their work, giving them platforms when mainstream outlets would not. This network of support helped ensure that their contributions were not overlooked or forgotten. The birth of African American art and music during the Great Migration period was a cultural revolution. It transformed how Black Americans expressed themselves and how they were perceived by the wider world. The movement was not only about entertainment, it was a bold declaration of identity, strength, and creativity. Its influence continues to shape American culture to this day, standing as a testament to the power of art to create change. The impact of the Harlem Renaissance on American culture. The Harlem Renaissance left a deep and lasting mark on American culture by introducing a new wave of African American creativity and thought. This movement reshaped the national view of Black identity, talent, and potential. Through literature, music, visual arts, and performance, African Americans challenged stereotypes and asserted their rightful place in American society. The cultural achievements of this era helped shift perceptions and laid the groundwork for future progress. One of the most profound impacts was the influence on American literature. Writers like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston explored themes of race, class, and humanity in ways that had never been done before. Their work resonated far beyond Harlem, influencing other writers and shaping the broader literary world. The Renaissance proved that Black voices had something powerful to contribute to national conversations. Music from the Harlem Renaissance played a key role in transforming American popular culture. Jazz and blues, rooted in African American tradition, spread rapidly and became defining genres in the music world. These styles changed how music was composed, performed, and appreciated. Even today, jazz remains one of the most celebrated contributions of African American culture to the global stage. Visual arts also flourished and impacted how African Americans were represented in media and public life. Artists created pieces that celebrated Black beauty, strength, and daily life, which stood in stark contrast to the negative imagery often found in mainstream culture. These works encouraged self-pride within the Black community and began to change how African Americans were viewed by the wider public. Art became a tool for reclaiming narrative and dignity. The Harlem Renaissance also brought about a new political awareness. As culture thrived, so did conversations around civil rights, identity, and justice. Intellectuals and artists alike used their platforms to question the status quo and highlight inequality. This spirit of activism, rooted in the cultural awakening of the Renaissance, later influenced the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. Beyond the African American community, the Harlem Renaissance enriched the broader American cultural fabric. It introduced mainstream audiences to new forms of expression and highlighted the contributions of Black Americans to national life. From Broadway to the publishing world, African American talent became harder to ignore. This broader exposure helped foster more inclusive attitudes, even if slowly and unevenly. Ultimately, the Harlem Renaissance was more than a cultural moment, it was a turning point in American history. It brought African American life and creativity to the forefront and demanded recognition and respect. Its legacy is still felt today in music, literature, art, and activism. The Renaissance proved that culture could be a force for transformation, pushing a nation toward greater understanding and inclusion. Chapter 5: The Second Wave of Migration. The second wave of the Great Migration began during the 1940s and continued into the 1970s, driven by new opportunities and persistent inequalities. As World War II created a demand for labor, many African Americans left the South in search of better-paying industrial jobs in the North and West. This wave of migration was even larger than the first, reshaping cities and communities across the country. The decision to move was not just about work, it was also a response to ongoing racism, segregation, and lack of freedom in the South. Unlike the first wave, which was concentrated mainly in northern cities, the second wave saw African Americans moving to western cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Seattle. These places were rapidly industrializing and had a growing need for workers in factories, shipyards, and defense industries. African American families followed the promise of new beginnings, settling into communities that would soon become hubs of Black culture and politics. This shift broadened the scope of the migration and brought new regions into the African American experience. War industries became a major pull factor during this period. As white men went off to fight in World War II, industries faced labor shortages and began recruiting Black workers to fill the gaps. Though African Americans were often given the most dangerous or least desirable jobs, the wages and working conditions were still better than what they faced in the South. These jobs helped many families improve their standard of living and opened the door to new opportunities for the next generation. The second wave also came with new challenges. African Americans who moved to cities in the North and West often encountered housing discrimination, job segregation, and racial violence. Redlining and restrictive covenants kept Black families confined to specific neighborhoods, often overcrowded and underfunded. These conditions sparked frustration and demands for change, laying the foundation for civil rights activism in urban centers. Despite the hardships, the hope for a better future remained strong. Families who participated in this migration played a key role in the development of Black urban life. They built churches, businesses, schools, and social organizations that helped strengthen community bonds. These institutions offered support and empowerment in the face of systemic racism. Over time, the children and grandchildren of these migrants would go on to become leaders in movements for justice, education, and equality. This period also saw a shift in African American identity and culture as urban life created new experiences and expressions. The blending of Southern roots with urban influences led to new music, fashion, and political thought. Cities became incubators for ideas and activism, fostering a sense of unity and shared purpose. African American voices grew louder and more organized, pushing back against oppression in increasingly powerful ways. The second wave of migration was not just a movement of people, but a transformation of American society. It altered the racial and cultural landscape of the country and challenged the status quo in ways that would echo for generations. The strength and determination of those who moved helped lay the groundwork for future progress. Their journey was both a continuation and an expansion of the struggle for equality and opportunity. The Great Depression and its impact on migration patterns. The Great Depression, which began with the stock market crash in 1929, had a major influence on African American migration patterns. As the economy collapsed, jobs vanished and poverty spread across the country. African Americans, already facing discrimination in employment, were often the first to be laid off and the last to be rehired. This economic downturn halted much of the momentum from the early waves of the Great Migration. Many African Americans who had recently moved to northern cities found themselves out of work and struggling to survive. The promised opportunities of industrial jobs dried up, forcing families to depend on public relief or return to low-paying work. Housing conditions worsened, and overcrowding became more common in Black neighborhoods. Despite these hardships, most migrants chose to stay rather than return to the South, where racial oppression remained intense. In the South, the Depression intensified already poor living conditions for African Americans. Sharecroppers and tenant farmers faced plummeting crop prices, making it nearly impossible to earn a living. The collapse of the agricultural economy pushed many to consider leaving, even if options elsewhere seemed limited. For those who remained, life was marked by hunger, debt, and continued racial violence. Though overall migration slowed during the 1930s, there were still movements of people, especially within regions. Some African Americans left rural areas for nearby cities in hopes of finding relief work or better housing. Others moved between northern cities, looking for jobs wherever they could be found. These smaller migrations, while less dramatic than earlier waves, still reshaped communities and altered the social fabric of many neighborhoods. Federal New Deal programs had mixed effects on African Americans during the Depression. While some initiatives offered relief and work opportunities, discrimination often limited Black access to benefits. Programs like the WPA and CCC employed thousands of African Americans, but usually in segregated conditions and for lower wages. Still, these jobs helped keep families afloat during the worst years and offered a degree of stability. The Depression also highlighted racial inequalities in a more visible way, fueling early civil rights efforts. African American leaders and organizations began demanding equal access to relief, employment, and housing. This era helped set the stage for greater political engagement and advocacy in the decades to follow. The economic crisis exposed the need for systemic change, both economically and socially. Despite the setbacks of the Great Depression, African American migration would regain strength in the 1940s as World War II created new job opportunities. The hardships of the 1930s left lasting scars but also built resilience within Black communities. Lessons learned during the Depression informed future migration decisions and strategies for survival. It was a decade of struggle, but also of endurance and preparation for what was to come. New push and pull factors. The new push and pull factors that shaped African American migration during the mid-20th century were influenced by both local and national changes. As the Great Depression ended and World War II began, the economic landscape shifted, creating new reasons for African Americans to move. The South, still plagued by racial discrimination, violence, and economic instability, continued to push Black families north and west in search of better opportunities. The promise of industrial jobs and higher wages in the North became a major pull, offering a path to improved living standards. One of the strongest pull factors was the booming war industries in northern and western cities. As factories ramped up production for the war effort, there was a critical need for workers. African Americans were actively recruited to fill these positions, especially in cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles. These new jobs were often in manufacturing, shipbuilding, and other industrial sectors, providing a more stable income than what many had in the South. In the South, many African Americans continued to face harsh conditions, with sharecropping and tenant farming keeping them trapped in poverty. The agricultural economy, hit hard by the Depression, made it difficult for Black families to survive. The limited access to education and healthcare further pushed African Americans to leave, seeking opportunities where their rights might be respected. The pervasive racial violence, especially in rural areas, also drove many to seek safety in more progressive urban environments. The expanding civil rights movement also played a significant role in migration patterns. As African Americans began organizing for equal rights, the cities in the North and West offered a more politically active environment. These areas had a history of Black political engagement, and many African Americans saw these cities as places where they could more easily mobilize for change. The social and political climate in the South, still dominated by Jim Crow laws, made it difficult to push for the rights they desired. Economic opportunities in the North and West were not just limited to industrial work. Many African Americans were attracted by the growing Black middle class in cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The availability of better housing, better schools, and a wider range of social services made these regions appealing. With a higher standard of living, these cities offered a chance for upward mobility that was rare in the South. At the same time, the cultural pull of northern cities was significant. The Harlem Renaissance had already established cities like New York as centers of African American art, music, and intellectual life. As Black culture continued to thrive in these urban environments, many felt drawn to the cultural opportunities available in these cities. The music, theater, literature, and other forms of artistic expression were major attractions for many African Americans seeking a new life. Finally, the end of World War II marked a turning point in migration patterns. Many African Americans who had moved during the war decided to stay, as they had become established in their new communities. The post-war economic boom created new opportunities, especially in urban centers, leading to continued migration. The combination of economic opportunities, cultural vibrancy, and political engagement made the North and West irresistible to those seeking a better life. The push and pull factors of this era were deeply intertwined with the changing dynamics of American society. Migration to the West Coast and Chicago. The migration to the West Coast and Chicago during the mid-20th century was one of the most significant movements of African Americans in search of better opportunities. After World War II, the West Coast, particularly California, became a major destination for Black migrants. Cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and Seattle attracted people due to the booming defense industry, which created job opportunities in shipyards, aircraft manufacturing, and other wartime production. These cities offered a promising future, with better wages and a more progressive political atmosphere than the South. Chicago, too, became a major center for African American migration. During the early 20th century, the city had already begun to see an influx of Southern migrants, and by the 1940s, its population grew even further. Chicago's industrial base provided thousands of jobs, especially in meatpacking, steel mills, and factories. These jobs were often stable and paid well, providing black families with the chance to escape the economic hardships they faced in the South. Both the West Coast and Chicago were appealing for their opportunities in industrial and wartime employment, but they also offered a sense of greater political freedom. In Chicago, African Americans were able to engage more easily in political life, with more established black leadership and organizations than they had in the South. On the West Coast, cities like Los Angeles offered a relatively open political environment, with fewer overt barriers to black participation in public life. This freedom of expression was an important draw for those looking for a fresh start. Another key factor for migration to the West Coast was the promise of better living conditions. California's cities, such as Los Angeles and Oakland, were expanding rapidly during and after World War II, and many neighborhoods were being built to accommodate the growing population. For many African Americans, the idea of better housing, a higher standard of living, and less overt racism than in the South was a compelling reason to move west. The West Coast's relatively more progressive attitudes toward race made it an attractive place for those looking for more opportunities and less hostility. Chicago, similarly, became a place of stability for black families seeking better futures. African Americans found a strong sense of community in Chicago, with institutions like churches, social organizations, and businesses catering to black residents. These institutions provided support in navigating the challenges of urban life and allowed black communities to grow stronger. Chicago also had a robust labor movement, which further helped African Americans find work and advocate for better conditions. However, life in both the West Coast and Chicago was not without challenges. While these regions offered new opportunities, they were still plagued by racial discrimination and segregation. On the West Coast, many African Americans still faced barriers to housing and employment, and the urban areas became crowded as more black migrants arrived. In Chicago, segregation was prevalent in schools, housing, and even within the workplace, limiting the potential for upward mobility. Despite these challenges, the West Coast and Chicago provided new opportunities that many felt outweighed the struggles they faced. Ultimately, the migration to the West Coast and Chicago marked a major chapter in the broader African American migration story. It was about more than just finding jobs. It was about seeking a new life in places that offered the possibility of freedom, equality, and the chance to build something better. These cities became not only centers of economic opportunity, but also hubs of black culture, politics, and activism. The legacy of this migration continues to shape the character of these cities, making them significant centers of African American life in America. Chapter 6: The Legacy of the Great Migration. The Great Migration left an indelible mark on American society, shaping the cultural, political, and economic landscape for generations. African Americans who moved from the South to the North and West brought with them new energy, ambition, and ideas. This migration played a pivotal role in transforming the cities that became home to black communities. It not only changed the demographics of major urban centers, but also contributed to the development of a distinctly African American urban culture that would have a lasting influence on the entire nation. One of the most significant legacies of the Great Migration is the lasting impact on African American culture. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles, black migrants helped create vibrant communities where art, music, literature, and political thought flourished. The Harlem Renaissance, born out of this migration, was just one example of how the movement reshaped black cultural identity. Through jazz, blues, literature, and other forms of expression, African Americans were able to assert their own narratives, challenging the stereotypes they had long been subjected to. Politically, the Great Migration had a profound effect on the African American community. With migration came the opportunity for greater political engagement and advocacy. In cities like Chicago and Detroit, African Americans gained political power, electing black leaders and securing representation in city government. This shift played a crucial role in the fight for civil rights, as black communities became more organized and vocal about their demands for equality, better living conditions, and an end to segregation. The economic impact of the Great Migration is also notable. Many African Americans who moved to northern and western cities were able to secure better-paying jobs and improve their standard of living. This new economic stability allowed for greater mobility within black communities, where individuals could invest in education, buy homes, and contribute to the growth of thriving black businesses. The economic opportunities found in these cities helped foster the development of a black middle class, which would become a major force in the fight for civil rights and social change. The Great Migration also contributed to the shaping of urban America. The influx of African American migrants in northern and western cities led to the growth and diversification of these urban centers. Neighborhoods like Harlem, South Chicago, and Watts became symbolic of the changing face of American cities, marked by the cultural and economic contributions of black communities. As these neighborhoods grew, they became focal points for political activism, as African Americans began to demand their rights and challenge the status quo. Despite the many successes of the Great Migration, it also left behind a legacy of challenges that continue to affect African American communities today. Although many migrants found greater opportunities, they still faced discrimination, poor housing conditions, and limited access to quality education and healthcare. The struggle for racial equality and justice was far from over, and many migrants found themselves in environments where they still had to fight for their rights. The legacy of these challenges became an important part of the ongoing civil rights movement. In the end, the Great Migration fundamentally altered the course of African American history and American society as a whole. The movement not only reshaped the physical and cultural landscape, but also played a critical role in the struggle for civil rights and equality. The individuals who participated in this migration laid the groundwork for future generations, contributing to a greater understanding of race, identity, and the fight for justice. Their legacy continues to be felt in the vibrant, diverse communities they helped create. The transformation of Northern politics. The Great Migration played a significant role in transforming the political landscape of northern cities. As African Americans moved from the South to the North, they brought with them a new level of political awareness and activism. In the cities they settled, they became a growing and influential voting bloc. This shift in population gave African Americans the power to influence elections and demand better living conditions, paving the way for more black political representation and involvement. The influx of African Americans into northern cities like Chicago, Detroit, and New York gave rise to a new political environment. As these cities experienced demographic changes, they began to see more African American candidates running for office and gaining political power. In Chicago, for example, African Americans were able to elect their own representatives, giving them a voice in local government. This increased political participation helped lay the groundwork for the civil rights movements of the mid-20th century. African American migration to the North also led to the formation of new political alliances. Black leaders and organizations, such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, found a strong base of support in the urban North. These organizations played a crucial role in advocating for African American rights, using their political clout to fight for better working conditions, fair housing, and an end to segregation. The political landscape in these cities became increasingly shaped by the demands of African American communities. The political transformation that took place in the North was not without challenges. Despite the growing political influence of African Americans, they still faced significant barriers to full participation. Discrimination in the form of gerrymandering, voter suppression, and segregated political systems was still widespread. However, the rise of African American political power marked the beginning of a long struggle for civil rights and equal representation that would continue into the 1960s and beyond. Northern politics also began to reflect the changing dynamics of race relations. As African Americans gained more political power, white politicians and political parties took notice. Some politicians began to address issues important to black communities, such as housing discrimination and access to education. The growing influence of African Americans in politics led to the creation of policies aimed at addressing racial inequality and improving the quality of life for black residents in northern cities. The migration of African Americans also influenced the national political scene. As more black voters became active in the North, political parties began to recognize the importance of the African American vote. The Democratic Party, in particular, saw an opportunity to gain support from black voters, leading to increased political engagement between African American communities and national political leaders. This shift in political dynamics played a key role in shaping the political strategies of both major parties throughout the 20th century. In the long term, the political transformation sparked by the Great Migration contributed to the development of a more inclusive political system in the United States. The growing political influence of African Americans in the North helped to pave the way for landmark legislation, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. These laws, which aimed to eliminate racial discrimination and ensure equal rights, were the result of decades of struggle and political activism, much of which was fueled by the migration of African Americans to northern cities. The shaping of African American identity. The Great Migration was a turning point in the shaping of African American identity, marking a shift from rural Southern traditions to urban Northern ways of life. As African Americans moved to cities in the North and West, they found themselves in new environments where they could redefine their cultural, social, and political identities. The migration helped to forge a collective sense of belonging among black communities that was not tied to the oppressive history of the South. In northern cities, African Americans were able to express their identity more freely, outside of the rigid racial restrictions they faced in the South. One of the most significant ways the Great Migration influenced African American identity was through the development of a stronger sense of community. In the urban centers they moved to, black migrants created neighborhoods and institutions that reflected their unique cultural and social values. Communities like Harlem in New York became symbolic of the new African American identity that was emerging. These neighborhoods became hubs for black culture, intellectual thought, and social activism, providing a space for African Americans to define their identity on their own terms. The Harlem Renaissance was a direct result of the Great Migration and played a crucial role in shaping African American identity. This cultural movement saw a flourishing of African American art, literature, music, and intellectualism. Writers like Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, and Claude McKay used their work to express the complexities of black identity, blending the experiences of the rural South with the new realities of urban life. This artistic movement helped to establish a new, more confident African American identity that embraced both the pain of the past and the possibilities of the future. African Americans who moved to the North were also exposed to different political and social ideas that shaped their sense of self. In contrast to the South, where racism and segregation were openly enforced, the North offered more opportunities for black participation in politics and social movements. The migration led to the formation of new political organizations and social clubs that allowed African Americans to unite for common causes, such as labor rights and racial equality. This new political engagement helped African Americans to see themselves not just as victims of racism, but as active participants in shaping their own destiny. The migration also led to the creation of a more distinct black middle class in northern cities. Many African American migrants were able to secure better-paying jobs in factories, businesses, and government positions, allowing them to build economic independence. This newfound economic stability contributed to a growing sense of pride in their identity, as they could now afford better housing, education, and social mobility. The emergence of a black middle class was important in redefining African American identity, as it challenged the stereotype of black inferiority that was often perpetuated in the South. While northern cities provided more opportunities for African Americans, they were not free of racial discrimination. In fact, African American migrants still faced significant barriers to housing, employment, and education in many northern cities. However, these challenges did not diminish the sense of empowerment that came with migration. Instead, they led to greater solidarity among African Americans as they banded together to fight for their rights and demand equality. This struggle for justice helped to solidify a shared African American identity that was rooted in resilience and resistance. In the years following the Great Migration, the African American identity that had taken shape in northern cities would go on to influence the broader civil rights movement. The cultural, social, and political changes sparked by the migration laid the foundation for the activism that would define the mid-20th century. The African American identity forged during this period was one of pride, self-determination, and a collective desire for justice and equality. It was an identity that would continue to evolve and inspire future generations in their ongoing fight for civil rights. The lasting impact on American society. The Great Migration had a profound and lasting impact on American society, shaping the nation's culture, economy, and politics for decades to come. African Americans who moved to northern and western cities helped to reshape the urban landscape, contributing to the growth of diverse multicultural communities. This demographic shift not only changed the composition of cities, but also altered the way race and identity were understood in the United States. The migration created new opportunities for black individuals while challenging the established social order, setting the stage for future movements for equality. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the Great Migration was its influence on the cultural fabric of the United States. As African Americans settled in northern cities like Harlem, Chicago, and Detroit, they brought with them rich cultural traditions that blended Southern heritage with new urban influences. This resulted in the flourishing of African American music, art, and literature, with movements like the Harlem Renaissance serving as a catalyst for a wider appreciation of black culture. Jazz, blues, and gospel music gained national recognition, fundamentally changing American music and creating new spaces for black artists to be heard. The migration also played a critical role in the evolution of African American political power. As black populations grew in northern and western cities, African Americans began to exert more influence in local and national politics. The increased political participation of African Americans helped to push for civil rights reforms and better living conditions. Over time, this political shift contributed to landmark changes in American society, such as the Civil Rights Movement and the election of African American leaders to office, culminating in the election of Barack Obama as president in 2008. Economically, the Great Migration altered the workforce and contributed to the development of a black middle class. Many African Americans who moved to northern cities found better-paying jobs in manufacturing, education, and other sectors, allowing them to build wealth and achieve a higher standard of living. This new economic stability provided African American families with more resources to invest in education, property, and business ventures, helping to close the gap between black and white communities in some areas. The migration also brought about greater mobility, as individuals who had once been limited by the segregation of the South were now able to take advantage of opportunities in the North and West. While African Americans benefited economically from the Great Migration, the movement also exposed racial disparities that still existed in urban areas. Northern cities, though less overtly segregated than the South, still had their own forms of discrimination and inequality. Housing discrimination, job segregation, and limited access to quality education were common in many northern cities. Despite these challenges, the migration laid the groundwork for future civil rights efforts, as African Americans in urban areas began to organize and demand their rights, fueling activism that would define the 20th century. The Great Migration also helped to redefine American cities, making them more dynamic and diverse. As African Americans moved into these urban centers, they brought with them a new sense of culture and energy. Cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles became increasingly multicultural, with Black communities contributing to the economic and social vibrancy of these areas. The impact of the migration can still be seen in the diverse populations of these cities today, as the African American experience continues to shape the character and identity of urban America. In conclusion, the Great Migration had a profound and lasting impact on American society. It reshaped the cultural, economic, and political landscape of the United States, influencing everything from music and art to the civil rights movement. The migration also helped to build a stronger, more vocal African American community, one that would go on to fight for equality and justice. The legacy of the Great Migration continues to influence American society today, as the contributions of African American communities remain central to the nation's identity and progress. Chapter 7. Reflections on the Migration and its Future. The Great Migration remains one of the most significant events in American history, with lasting effects on the African American community and the broader society. It was not just a movement of people, but a transformation of lives, cultures, and identities. As millions of African Americans left the rural South for northern and western cities, they carved out new opportunities and reshaped the cultural, political, and economic landscapes. While much has been achieved, the legacy of the Great Migration continues to influence contemporary discussions on race, inequality, and opportunity in the United States. Reflecting on the migration, it's clear that it was both a triumph and a struggle. African Americans who migrated found new opportunities, particularly in terms of employment and education, but they also faced racial discrimination in their new environments. Northern cities, though less overtly racist than the South, still held barriers to full equality. Nonetheless, the migration marked a shift in Black consciousness and identity, allowing African Americans to demand more rights and better conditions. This resilience helped pave the way for future civil rights movements and political change. The cultural impact of the Great Migration cannot be overstated. It gave rise to a new, more confident African American culture, especially seen in movements like the Harlem Renaissance. African American music, art, and literature blossomed in northern cities, and these cultural contributions reshaped the nation's understanding of race and identity. Over time, the cultural influence of Black Americans spread across the country, and elements of African American culture became central to the American mainstream. This cultural shift continues to shape how African Americans are represented and celebrated in the media today. Politically, the Great Migration was a catalyst for change. As African Americans moved to urban centers, they gained political power and began to demand representation and rights. This led to greater Black political engagement, especially during the Civil Rights Movement, when the power of the African American vote was a major force. Over the decades, the political landscape shifted as more Black politicians emerged, and African American communities became increasingly involved in national politics. This political awakening has influenced elections, policy debates, and social reforms, marking a long-term shift in the political influence of African Americans. Looking ahead, the lessons of the Great Migration remain relevant. The migration demonstrated the importance of access to economic opportunities, political representation, and social mobility. Today, African Americans continue to face challenges such as racial inequality, economic disparities, and educational inequities. However, the spirit of the Great Migration continues to inspire new generations to fight for change. The migration showed that even in the face of adversity, communities can rise, and people can redefine their circumstances. The future of migration patterns in the United States may look different, but the underlying struggles remain similar. Economic migration continues, though now it may be driven by factors like technology, climate change, or shifting job markets. African Americans, along with other marginalized groups, will continue to seek better opportunities, just as they did in the early 20th century. While the focus has shifted, the core issues of equality, opportunity, and justice remain, and the Great Migration serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience and determination of those who sought to improve their lives and their communities. In conclusion, the Great Migration was a pivotal moment in American history. It reshaped African American identity, altered the political landscape, and transformed American culture. Though much has been achieved, the challenges of race, equality, and opportunity continue to evolve. The migration's legacy lives on in the ongoing fight for justice, and its lessons are as vital today as they were a century ago. As we reflect on the migration, we are reminded of the power of movement, change, and hope for a better future. The continuing journey of African Americans in America. The journey of African Americans in America is far from over, with the echoes of the Great Migration still resonating in today's society. Over a century after the migration began, African Americans continue to face systemic challenges related to race, inequality, and access to opportunities. The legacy of the migration lives on through the resilience of African American communities who continue to fight for civil rights, social justice, and economic advancement. While progress has been made, the journey toward true equality remains an ongoing struggle. Economic inequality remains one of the most pressing issues for African Americans. Despite significant strides in educational attainment and professional advancement, African Americans still face higher unemployment rates and lower wages compared to their white counterparts. The migration of African Americans from the South to the North and West helped create new economic opportunities, but the barriers of systemic racism continue to restrict full participation in the economic system. The impact of historical segregation in housing, education, and employment still shapes the economic disparities that persist today. Education, another crucial element of the migration, continues to play a vital role in shaping the future of African American communities. Historically, the migration allowed African Americans to access better educational opportunities, but challenges remain. African American students still face disproportionate rates of school discipline, lack of resources, and barriers to higher education. Despite these challenges, African Americans continue to push for educational reforms that will better serve their communities, ensuring that future generations will have the opportunities needed to thrive. Politically, the African American community has made significant gains since the time of the Great Migration. The voting power of African Americans has increased dramatically, with record-breaking voter turnout in recent elections. African Americans now hold positions of power in local, state, and national governments, influencing policy and legislation that impacts the broader society. However, voting rights are still under threat, with new voter suppression laws and practices emerging in some states. The fight for equal political representation and access to the ballot box continues to be a critical aspect of the African American struggle. Social justice remains a central focus of African American activism. The rise of movements like Black Lives Matter reflects a growing demand for accountability and systemic change in law enforcement and the justice system. While the Great Migration allowed African Americans to escape the most overt forms of racial violence in the South, police brutality and the mass incarceration of Black individuals continue to be pervasive issues. The continuing fight for justice and equality remains a vital part of the African American experience and a key component of the ongoing journey toward full civil rights. The cultural impact of African Americans also continues to be a major force in shaping American society. The music, literature, and art that flourished during the Harlem Renaissance have evolved into modern-day expressions of Black identity, such as hip-hop, contemporary literature, and visual art. African American culture is now a driving force in mainstream American culture, influencing everything from fashion to politics. The continuing cultural contributions of African Americans serve as a testament to the strength, creativity, and resilience of a community that has long been marginalized. Looking ahead, the African American journey in America will continue to evolve, shaped by new generations of leaders and activists. While much has been achieved since the Great Migration, new challenges emerge with each passing decade. The future of African Americans in the United States depends on continued progress in education, economic opportunity, social justice, and political representation. The legacy of the Great Migration serves as a reminder that the journey is ongoing, with the promise of a more just and equitable society still on the horizon. Revisiting the dream of economic and social equality. The dream of economic and social equality for African Americans remains a powerful and vital force in the United States, but it is still an unfinished aspiration. The Great Migration marked a hopeful chapter in the African American pursuit of better opportunities, but the journey toward true equality is ongoing. While African Americans have made significant strides in areas like education, politics, and culture, the gaps in wealth, income, and social mobility persist. The dream of a fully integrated society where everyone has equal opportunities remains elusive, and the battle for equality continues in various forms. Economic equality is perhaps the most pressing issue today. Despite the advancements made during the Great Migration, African Americans still face significant disparities in wealth and income. Many African American communities continue to struggle with unemployment, underemployment, and lower wages than their white counterparts. Although African Americans have made headway in securing better jobs and establishing businesses, systemic barriers, such as discrimination and unequal access to resources, continue to limit the full realization of economic opportunity. The racial wealth gap remains a significant challenge. African Americans, on average, have far less wealth than white Americans, due in large part to the historical effects of slavery, segregation, and discriminatory practices like redlining. While homeownership, a key factor in building wealth, has been a long-held goal, African American families still face challenges in accessing mortgages and securing home loans at the same rates as white families. These barriers continue to perpetuate cycles of poverty in many African American communities, hindering efforts to achieve economic equality. Social equality is equally important and equally elusive. While African Americans have made gains in terms of civil rights, discrimination and bias still persist in many areas of American life. In education, African American students are more likely to attend underfunded schools and face harsher disciplinary actions than their white peers. In the criminal justice system, African Americans are disproportionately affected by police violence and mass incarceration. These disparities reveal the deep-seated nature of social inequality that continues to affect African Americans despite decades of struggle and progress. Political participation has been a significant factor in the fight for equality, with African Americans gaining more influence over time. Voter participation among African Americans has increased, and more Black individuals are holding positions in government than ever before. However, voter suppression tactics, gerrymandering, and disenfranchisement continue to threaten the democratic rights of African Americans. The fight for political equality is far from over, and protecting the right to vote and ensuring equal representation is essential for achieving social equality. In conclusion, the dream of economic and social equality for African Americans remains a work in progress. The Great Migration represented a hopeful step toward better opportunities, but systemic barriers continue to hinder full equality. As African Americans continue to push for greater economic and social rights, the struggle for justice and fairness remains central to the national conversation. The fight for equality is ongoing, and it is only through continued activism, education, and policy reform that the dream of true equality can be realized. How the Great Migration continues to shape America today. The Great Migration had profound and lasting effects on the demographic and cultural landscape of the United States, and its influence can still be seen in many aspects of American life today. The movement of millions of African Americans from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West changed not only the lives of those who migrated, but also the fabric of the cities they moved to. This shift helped redefine American culture, politics, and society, and its impact is still felt in the racial, economic, and cultural dynamics of modern America. One of the most lasting impacts of the Great Migration is the growth of African American communities in major northern cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit. These urban centers became cultural hubs for African Americans, fostering vibrant artistic, political, and intellectual movements, such as the Harlem Renaissance. Today, these cities continue to serve as important centers of African American culture, where music, art, and literature flourish and influence broader American culture. The Great Migration helped create a strong urban Black identity that continues to shape African American experiences and expressions. Economically, the Great Migration opened up new opportunities for African Americans, although challenges persist. The migration allowed African Americans to escape the worst of Southern racial oppression and find better-paying jobs in industrial cities. While African Americans were able to achieve greater financial stability in the North and West, the lingering effects of economic inequality, such as the racial wealth gap and high unemployment rates, still affect these communities. The Great Migration, however, was a critical step in the ongoing quest for economic equality, creating pathways to better jobs and greater financial independence for many African American families. Politically, the migration empowered African Americans by expanding their influence in urban areas, where they could more effectively organize and advocate for civil rights. The concentration of African Americans in northern cities led to greater political representation and activism, particularly during the civil rights movement. The migration also helped shape national politics by bolstering the African American vote, making it a key factor in elections. Today, African American political engagement remains a powerful force, continuing to shape national discourse on issues like voting rights, criminal justice reform, and social justice. Socially, the Great Migration helped foster a sense of community and solidarity among African Americans in new, diverse settings. It contributed to the development of African American institutions, such as churches, schools, and businesses, which played a crucial role in building social cohesion and providing resources. While African American communities continue to face systemic challenges, the legacy of the Great Migration has been one of resilience and solidarity. The migration not only reshaped the lives of those who participated, but also contributed to the ongoing fight for racial equality and social justice in America today.
The Pioneers. 10 Facts about the Mormon Persecution and Settlements in the West. Chapter 1: The Roots of Faith. The origins of the Mormon religion can be traced back to the early 19th century in upstate New York. A young man named Joseph Smith claimed to have had a vision of God and Jesus Christ, who instructed him to restore the true church. Smith translated the Book of Mormon, which he said was a record of ancient American prophets. This book became the foundational text for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, commonly known as the Mormon Church. Joseph Smith's teachings quickly gained followers, many of whom believed in his divine mission. Despite early opposition, Smith and his followers established a thriving community, promoting values of family, work, and religious devotion. However, as the movement grew, so did tensions with non-Mormon neighbors. The Mormons' growing influence in local politics and their distinct religious practices caused fear and hostility among nearby residents. The first significant persecution the Mormons faced occurred in Missouri in the early 1830s. The tensions escalated when a group of anti-Mormon settlers attacked the Mormon community in Jackson County, forcing them to leave. Smith and his followers moved to the neighboring county of Caldwell, where they were promised protection, but their troubles continued. In 1838, violence erupted again, and the Missouri governor issued an infamous order to expel the Mormons from the state. During this time, Joseph Smith worked tirelessly to strengthen the religious and social structure of the Mormon community. He introduced practices like baptism for the dead and a communal lifestyle known as the law of consecration. Despite these efforts, the Mormons continued to face increasing violence and discrimination. Their beliefs and practices, particularly polygamy, were viewed with suspicion and disdain by outsiders. In the wake of escalating tensions, Smith and other Mormon leaders were arrested on charges ranging from treason to murder. Despite the lack of evidence, Smith was imprisoned in Liberty Jail, where he faced harsh conditions. During his imprisonment, Smith received what Mormons believe were divine revelations, which he later shared with his followers. These revelations strengthened the resolve of the Mormons to continue their journey and reinforced their belief in their divine mission. After Smith's release from jail, the Mormons attempted to relocate to Illinois, where they founded the city of Nauvoo. The city became a symbol of Mormon resilience, with Smith leading the community in building temples and establishing a complex social system. However, Nauvoo's success also fueled resentment among non-Mormons, who grew increasingly hostile to the Mormon presence in the region. By the mid-1840s, Joseph Smith's leadership faced significant challenges, both from within and outside the Mormon community. His increasing influence and claims to divine authority alienated some of his followers. Ultimately, Smith's controversial actions, including his practice of polygamy and attempts to run for president, led to growing opposition. In 1844, Smith was murdered by a mob while incarcerated in Carthage, Illinois, marking a turning point in the history of the Mormon faith. Origins of the Mormon religion. The Mormon religion began in the early 1800s in the small town of Sharon, Vermont, where Joseph Smith was born in 1805. Growing up in a religiously diverse environment, Smith became curious about the different denominations and sought to understand which was the true church. He often faced confusion, as many different sects claimed to be the right one. His quest for spiritual truth would eventually lead him to claim a divine visitation. At the age of 14, Smith reported experiencing a vision in the woods near his home, which he called the first vision. In this vision, he claimed to have seen God the Father and Jesus Christ, who told him that all existing churches were wrong and that he should not join any of them. This event became the foundation of Mormon theology, establishing Smith's role as a prophet who would restore the true gospel. It was also the beginning of Smith's journey to bring forth new religious teachings. A few years after this vision, Joseph Smith claimed to have been visited by an angel named Moroni, who revealed the location of a set of golden plates buried near his home. According to Smith, these plates contained the writings of ancient prophets who lived on the American continent. Smith was instructed to translate these writings into English, which became the Book of Mormon, published in 1830. This book is considered the cornerstone of Mormon scripture and contains the story of an ancient civilization that flourished in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. Smith's translation of the Book of Mormon marked the official founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He formally established the church in 1830, with a small group of followers who believed in his divine calling. The book quickly gained a following, with many accepting its teachings and regarding Smith as a prophet. The church's early growth was rapid, as people were drawn to its promise of a restored gospel and the hope for a new spiritual community. As Smith continued to receive revelations, the teachings of the church became more defined. He introduced new doctrines, including the concept of eternal progression, the practice of baptism for the dead, and the belief in the literal gathering of Israel. Smith's teachings attracted a diverse following, with people from various walks of life coming to join the movement. However, these teachings also made many enemies, especially as they began to challenge traditional Christian doctrines and norms. One of the most controversial aspects of Mormonism was the practice of polygamy, which Smith introduced in the early 1840s. He taught that it was a commandment from God for certain individuals to marry multiple wives in order to build a large, strong community. This practice caused significant tension with non-Mormon settlers, who viewed it as immoral and illegal. Despite the growing opposition, Smith defended the practice as divinely sanctioned and continued to advocate for it. The origins of the Mormon religion set the stage for a tumultuous period of growth, persecution, and migration. Smith's vision and teachings laid the foundation for a movement that would challenge existing religious, social, and political structures. Despite facing intense opposition, Joseph Smith's followers remained devoted to his leadership, believing that he was divinely chosen to restore the true gospel. This belief would drive the Mormons westward, where they would eventually establish a new home in the Utah Territory. Joseph Smith and the Early Church. Joseph Smith's early life was marked by personal struggles and a search for spiritual truth. Growing up in a poor family, Smith experienced both religious curiosity and confusion, as his family attended various Christian denominations. In his youth, he became deeply troubled by the religious divisions of the time and sought answers. This led to his famous vision in 1820, in which he claimed to see God the Father and Jesus Christ, who told him that all existing churches were wrong and that he should not join any. After his first vision, Smith felt that he had a special mission to fulfill. In 1823, he reported being visited by the angel Moroni, who told him about the existence of golden plates that contained the record of ancient prophets. These plates, Moroni claimed, were buried near Smith's home in Palmyra, New York. Smith eventually retrieved the plates, which he said were written in an ancient language, and began translating them into what would become the Book of Mormon. The Book of Mormon was published in 1830, marking the formal beginning of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Smith and his followers believed the book was a divine revelation and the restoration of the true gospel. The early church attracted a small but dedicated group of believers who saw Smith as a prophet chosen by God. As a result, the church quickly grew, despite widespread opposition from those who viewed Smith's claims as blasphemous. During the early years of the church, Smith continued to receive what he claimed were divine revelations. These revelations, recorded and codified as the Doctrine and Covenants, provided further guidance on church structure, teachings, and practices. Smith's role as a prophet was central to the new church, and he began to organize it into a hierarchical structure with apostles, elders, and other leaders. His leadership was seen by his followers as divinely appointed, and they believed that through him, they were receiving the restored truths of the gospel. The rapid growth of the church drew the attention of local authorities and the broader religious community. Many non-Mormons viewed Smith's teachings as a threat to traditional Christian beliefs and began to persecute the early church. In 1830s Ohio, where the church initially found success, Smith and his followers faced hostility from local residents. As a result, the Mormons were forced to move, seeking a place where they could practice their faith without interference. By 1839, Smith and his followers had relocated to the state of Missouri, where they established a thriving community. However, tensions soon flared again between the Mormons and non-Mormons, leading to violent conflicts and ultimately the expulsion of the Mormons from the state. These events, including the infamous Missouri Extermination Order, shaped the early years of the church and solidified Smith's resolve to continue leading the Mormons, no matter the cost. Throughout this period, Joseph Smith's leadership was crucial in keeping the church together. Despite the persecution and the constant challenges they faced, Smith's followers remained loyal to him, seeing him as a prophet of God. His vision of a restored gospel and a new Zion continued to inspire Mormons to endure hardships and push forward. These early struggles laid the foundation for the later Mormon migration to Utah and the continued growth of the church under Brigham Young's leadership. First signs of persecution. The first signs of persecution against Joseph Smith and the early members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints emerged soon after the church's establishment in 1830. The new religion's beliefs, including the Book of Mormon and Smith's role as a prophet, were seen as a threat by many in the broader Christian community. Many local religious leaders and residents were suspicious of Smith's teachings, viewing them as a challenge to traditional Christian doctrine. As the church grew in size and influence, so did the hostility against it. In the early 1830s, tensions began to escalate in Smith's hometown of Palmyra, New York, and the surrounding area. The Mormons, as they came to be known, faced strong opposition from local residents who resented their increasing numbers and unusual practices. The belief in the Book of Mormon as divine scripture, alongside Smith's claims of visions and angelic visitations, caused concern among many who saw the church as a cult. The church's growing influence in the region only deepened the divide between Mormons and their neighbors. By 1831, the church had moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where it experienced both growth and greater resistance. The Mormons established a thriving community, but their increasing numbers and influence soon led to conflict with local residents. As the Mormons expanded, their practice of communal living and their claim to divine revelation created fear and anger among non-Mormon settlers. The residents of Kirtland saw the Mormon community as a powerful force that might challenge their social and political order. In 1833, the first major outbreak of violence occurred in Jackson County, Missouri, where many Mormons had gathered to establish a Zion. The Mormons' success in the area, particularly in terms of their economic prosperity and growing population, led to resentment from the local population. A mob destroyed the Mormons' homes and businesses, forcing them to leave the area. This act of violence was the beginning of a pattern of persecution that would continue throughout the early years of the church. The violence in Missouri continued to escalate, with anti-Mormon groups attacking Mormon settlements and harassing the members of the church. In 1836, a group of armed men threatened Mormons in the town of DeWitt, and soon after, in 1838, the situation deteriorated further. The Mormons were accused of causing trouble, and tensions rose to a boiling point. This led to more violent clashes between Mormons and non-Mormons, including the burning of Mormon homes and the destruction of their property. By late 1838, the situation had become so severe that Missouri's governor issued an order to expel all Mormons from the state. This order, known as the Missouri Extermination Order, gave legal justification for the violence and further persecution of Mormons. Smith and other church leaders were arrested and charged with treason, and many Mormons were forced to leave their homes in the dead of winter. This brutal treatment marked one of the darkest periods in the church's early history. The first signs of persecution, though devastating, strengthened the resolve of the Mormons. Despite the violence, they remained determined to continue their religious practices and their mission to establish Zion. Smith and his followers saw their suffering as part of their divine destiny, believing that persecution was a test of their faith. These early years of persecution laid the groundwork for the Mormon migration westward and the eventual establishment of a safe haven in the Utah Territory. Chapter 2: Driven from the East. The persecution of the Mormons in the East reached a critical point by the mid-1830s, pushing the community to seek a new place to settle. After facing mob violence and constant threats in Missouri, Joseph Smith and his followers sought refuge in nearby states. Despite their efforts to establish peaceful communities, the Mormons were met with hostility wherever they went. By the end of the 1830s, it became clear that they could not remain in the East, and they began to look westward for a place where they could practice their faith freely. In 1839, the Mormons were forced to leave Missouri after the state's governor issued the infamous Extermination Order. This order authorized the expulsion of Mormons from Missouri, and many were left homeless and destitute. They fled to Illinois, hoping to find a place where they could rebuild their lives. The city of Nauvoo, located on the banks of the Mississippi River, became their new home, where Smith and his followers sought to establish a thriving Mormon community. Nauvoo, which means beautiful place in Hebrew, seemed like a promising location for the Mormons. It offered fertile land and access to waterways, which would help with trade and transportation. Smith quickly began organizing the community, building homes, businesses, and even a grand temple. The city grew rapidly, attracting thousands of new members to the church. For a time, Nauvoo became a symbol of Mormon resilience and determination. However, the success of Nauvoo was short-lived, as tensions with neighboring non-Mormon communities began to rise. The rapid growth of the Mormon population, coupled with their unique religious practices, stirred fears among local residents. In particular, the Mormons' practice of polygamy, which was introduced by Smith in the early 1840s, caused a great deal of controversy. Many outsiders viewed this practice as immoral and contrary to the accepted norms of the time. As Smith's influence in Nauvoo grew, so did the resentment among local non-Mormons. The Mormons' increasing political power and their efforts to establish a theocratic government in Nauvoo created further friction. Smith's role as both a religious and political leader drew criticism from those who felt that his authority was undermining the existing political system. These tensions eventually led to violent confrontations between Mormons and non-Mormons in the region. In 1844, Joseph Smith's candidacy for the U.S. presidency further alienated him from his critics. His attempt to influence national politics, coupled with his controversial teachings, intensified the animosity directed toward him. This culminated in his arrest on charges of inciting violence and treason. While imprisoned in Carthage, Illinois, a mob stormed the jail and killed Smith, marking the end of his leadership and a turning point for the Mormon community. After Smith's death, the Mormons were once again faced with the challenge of survival and continuity. Brigham Young, Smith's successor, took charge and began organizing the community for a westward migration. The Mormons, having endured years of persecution and forced displacement, prepared to leave the East behind. Their journey would lead them to the uncharted wilderness of the West, where they hoped to build a society free from the violence and oppression they had faced in the East. Expulsion from Missouri. The expulsion of the Mormons from Missouri in 1838 remains one of the most dramatic events in the early history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Tensions between the Mormons and non-Mormons had been simmering for years, fueled by religious, political, and economic differences. The Mormons had settled in Jackson County, Missouri in the early 1830s, but their increasing numbers and influence quickly made them targets of hostility. Non-Mormon settlers viewed them as a threat to their social order and began to escalate their efforts to force them out of the state. By the summer of 1838, violence erupted between Mormons and their neighbors in Jackson County. Mobs attacked Mormon homes, destroyed their property, and threatened their lives. The situation became so dangerous that the Mormons were forced to abandon their land in Jackson County and move to neighboring counties, including Caldwell and Daviess. Despite their relocation, the violence and harassment continued, and many Mormons were left in poverty and without the means to rebuild their lives. The Missouri state government, instead of intervening to protect the Mormons, sided with the non-Mormon population. In October 1838, tensions reached a boiling point when a Mormon group was accused of killing a local man during a skirmish with anti-Mormon militias. The conflict sparked further violence, and the governor of Missouri, Lilburn W. Boggs, issued an executive order known as the Extermination Order, which authorized the expulsion of all Mormons from the state. The Extermination Order gave the legal backing for the persecution of the Mormons. It essentially declared that the Mormons were to be driven from Missouri or exterminated, which led to widespread violence and forced relocation. In response to the order, many Mormons fled to the nearby town of Far West, hoping to find safety. However, the situation grew even more dire, and the Mormons were no longer able to resist the mounting pressure from the state and local militias. Joseph Smith, the leader of the Mormon Church, was arrested along with several other church leaders and charged with treason, conspiracy, and other crimes. The charges were largely fabricated, and there was no concrete evidence to support them. Smith and his followers were held in the Liberty Jail under harsh conditions, where Smith wrote letters expressing his faith and determination to overcome the challenges they faced. Despite the lack of justice, the Mormons were left with little recourse but to endure the harsh conditions. As the Mormons faced the harsh reality of the extermination order, many were forced to leave their homes and seek refuge in other states. The winter of 1838 to 1839 was particularly brutal, and many Mormons died from exposure, illness, and starvation. The forced expulsion from Missouri marked the beginning of a long period of suffering for the Mormons, but it also hardened their resolve to continue their mission and eventually find a place where they could practice their faith freely. After Joseph Smith's release from jail and the end of the extermination order in 1839, the Mormons were still unable to return to Missouri. They were forced to relocate once again, this time to Illinois, where they established the city of Nauvoo. While their hardships in Missouri were devastating, the experience strengthened the bonds within the Mormon community and solidified their determination to establish a new home where they could live according to their beliefs without fear of persecution. The Nauvoo experience. After being expelled from Missouri, the Mormons found a new home in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1839. The city, situated on the banks of the Mississippi River, offered fertile land and an ideal location for the growing Mormon community. Joseph Smith and his followers quickly began to establish a city where they could rebuild their lives. Nauvoo was soon transformed into a thriving center of commerce, culture, and religious life for Mormons, offering hope and stability after years of persecution. The Mormons worked together to build the infrastructure of Nauvoo, constructing homes, businesses, and a grand temple. The construction of the Nauvoo Temple became a central project for the community. The temple was intended to be a sacred place for Mormon rituals, including baptisms, ordinances, and other religious ceremonies. Smith emphasized the importance of the temple in the spiritual life of the Mormons, and its construction became a symbol of their faith and perseverance. The rapid growth of Nauvoo drew the attention of both neighboring non-Mormon communities and the state government. While the Mormons were building their city, tensions with their non-Mormon neighbors started to rise again. The Mormons' increasing political power, religious influence, and social unity made them a target of criticism. Many outsiders viewed the Mormons as a threat to the established social and political order, and they began to openly oppose the Mormon community. Joseph Smith's role in Nauvoo was not just religious, he also served as a political leader. In 1844, he ran for President of the United States, further alienating him from his critics. His efforts to influence national politics, combined with his controversial religious teachings, intensified the hostility directed at him and the Mormons. As a result, Smith's leadership became even more contentious, with non-Mormon residents fearing the increasing power of the Mormon community in the region. Despite these tensions, Smith continued to lead the Mormons with a vision of building a utopian society in Nauvoo. He introduced new doctrines and practices, including the controversial practice of polygamy, which further divided public opinion. Many Mormons accepted Smith's teachings as divine revelation, while others began to question his authority. The introduction of polygamy, in particular, led to further conflict both within the church and with outsiders, as it challenged traditional societal norms. In June 1844, Joseph Smith's leadership came to a tragic end when he was arrested and imprisoned in Carthage, Illinois, on charges of treason. While in jail, Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by a mob that stormed the building. Their deaths shocked the Mormon community and left a leadership vacuum in Nauvoo. Smith's martyrdom further galvanized the faith of his followers, but it also left them vulnerable to even greater challenges in the years ahead. Following Smith's death, leadership of the Mormon Church passed to Brigham Young, who would lead the Mormons on their westward migration. Despite the turmoil surrounding Smith's death, the Mormons continued to hold on to their faith and their vision of building a holy community. The Nauvoo experience, with its rapid growth, challenges, and the death of their prophet, ultimately set the stage for the Mormons' journey westward in search of a place where they could live in peace and practice their faith freely. The martyrdom of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith's life came to a tragic end in June 1844, when he was killed by a mob in Carthage, Illinois. His death marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and had profound implications for the Mormon community. At the time of his death, Smith was imprisoned on charges of treason related to his role in ordering the destruction of a press that had criticized him and the church. Despite his arrest, many of his followers believed the charges against him were politically motivated and that he was being persecuted for his religious beliefs. The circumstances leading to Smith's arrest were deeply political. Tensions had been escalating between the Mormons and non-Mormons in Nauvoo, Illinois, as Smith's influence in both the religious and political spheres had grown. His decision to run for President of the United States and his control over the city's government added to the concerns of his critics, who viewed him as a dangerous and growing power. These tensions ultimately led to Smith being arrested and charged with inciting violence and treason, charges that were largely fabricated by his enemies. While in jail, Smith remained calm and composed despite the grave situation. He and his brother Hiram, the church's second-in-command, were held under harsh conditions, but Smith continued to show a strong sense of leadership and faith. In Carthage jail, Smith wrote letters to his followers, expressing his faith and commitment to the principles of the gospel. He reassured them that despite the trials they faced, they were part of a divine mission that would ultimately prevail. On June 27, 1844, the situation took a deadly turn. A mob of anti-Mormon individuals stormed Carthage jail, where Smith and his brother were being held. The mob, which included both local residents and armed men, broke into the jail and began to fire at Smith and his companions. Smith attempted to escape by jumping from a second-story window, but was shot multiple times by the mob as he fell. His brother Hiram was also shot and killed during the attack. Joseph Smith's death sent shockwaves through the Mormon community. He was seen as a prophet, a leader, and a visionary, and his martyrdom deepened the faith of many Mormons who believed that his death fulfilled a divine prophecy. His followers mourned his loss deeply, but his death also strengthened their resolve to continue the mission he had started. Smith's martyrdom was seen by his followers as a sign that he was a true prophet, chosen by God to restore the gospel. In the aftermath of Smith's death, the Mormon community faced a crisis of leadership. While Smith had named his successor, Brigham Young, many of his followers struggled with the idea of continuing without him. Brigham Young took control of the church and quickly began to organize the community for a westward migration. However, the loss of their prophet left many Mormons grieving and uncertain of what the future would hold. The martyrdom of Joseph Smith became a defining moment for the Mormon faith. His death was viewed by his followers as a testament to the truth of his teachings and the divine mission he had led. His martyrdom further solidified the bond between the Mormons and their faith, inspiring them to continue their journey westward to find a place where they could live free from persecution. Joseph Smith's legacy, despite his untimely death, would continue to shape the direction of the church and the lives of its members for generations to come. Chapter 3: The Great Exodus. In the wake of Joseph Smith's death, the Mormon community faced a new set of challenges, with many members uncertain about their future. Under the leadership of Brigham Young, the Mormons began to prepare for a mass migration westward, seeking a place where they could practice their faith without fear of persecution. The decision to leave Nauvoo was not made lightly, as it meant abandoning the city they had worked so hard to build. However, with increasing threats from both local non-Mormons and political authorities, the Mormons had little choice but to embark on a dangerous journey. The Great Exodus began in 1846, as the Mormons began to leave Nauvoo in small groups. The decision to move was driven by the growing hostility from neighboring communities, who resented the Mormons' power and influence in Illinois. Brigham Young and church leaders believed that the only way for the Mormons to survive was to find a new home in the uncharted West. The journey would be grueling and dangerous, but it offered a chance for the Mormons to establish a society based on their religious principles. The initial stages of the migration were difficult. The Mormons had to leave behind much of their property and belongings, taking only what they could carry. Many of the emigrants had no experience with long-distance travel, or the harsh conditions of the American wilderness. As the Mormons made their way westward, they faced numerous challenges, including scarce resources, harsh weather, and the constant threat of attacks from Native American tribes and hostile settlers. The Mormon exodus was not a quick or easy journey. The group traveled in wagon trains, often divided into smaller groups for safety and to conserve resources. The Mormons' determination to reach the West was strong, but the journey proved to be physically and emotionally taxing. Along the way, many of the emigrants fell ill, and some even died due to the harsh conditions. The loss of loved ones during the journey was a painful experience that tested the faith and resolve of the survivors. As the Mormons continued their journey, Brigham Young's leadership proved vital in maintaining the group's unity and focus. He organized the emigrants into efficient wagon trains, ensuring that they moved together and supported one another. Young also made important decisions about where to stop and rest, which helped the group avoid unnecessary dangers. Despite the hardships, Young's leadership inspired confidence among the Mormons, who were committed to reaching a new home where they could live free from persecution. By the time the Mormon emigrants reached the Rocky Mountains, many had already endured significant hardships, including exposure, illness, and hunger. However, their perseverance paid off as they approached the Valley of the Great Salt Lake. Brigham Young and his followers saw the valley as the promised land where they could establish a new Zion. The sight of the valley was both a relief and a triumph for the weary travelers, marking the end of their long and arduous journey. The Great Exodus was a defining moment in Mormon history. It demonstrated the strength, resilience, and determination of the Mormon people, who were willing to endure tremendous hardship in the pursuit of religious freedom. Upon arriving in the Salt Lake Valley, the Mormons set about creating a new society that reflected their beliefs and values. This journey westward, despite the immense challenges, became a testament to the Mormon faith and the unwavering commitment of its followers to create a place where they could live according to their religious principles. Brigham Young takes leadership. After the death of Joseph Smith, Brigham Young emerged as the natural leader of the Mormon community. Young, a pragmatic and charismatic figure, had been a close confidant of Smith and was well regarded by the Mormon faithful. His leadership was crucial during the period of uncertainty that followed Smith's assassination. Despite initial doubts from some members of the church, Young quickly established his authority, guiding the Mormons through the most challenging period of their history. In the months following Smith's death, Young's leadership was tested as the Mormons faced growing hostility from their non-Mormon neighbors. The community's safety was at risk, and the threat of violence from local mobs and authorities loomed large. Young knew that staying in Nauvoo was no longer viable, and that a westward migration was their only option. His decisiveness in taking charge and organizing the exodus gave the Mormon people a sense of direction and purpose. Under Young's leadership, the Mormons began to prepare for the Great Exodus. He oversaw the organization of the emigrants into groups, ensuring that they had the necessary supplies for the long journey west. Young's background as a skilled organizer and his ability to inspire confidence were key factors in the successful execution of the migration plan. He communicated a clear vision for the future, one that promised religious freedom and the opportunity to build a society based on Mormon principles in the western wilderness. As the Mormons set out on their journey to the west, Young's leadership continued to shine. He was able to maintain order and discipline within the wagon trains, often making difficult decisions to ensure the safety and well-being of the emigrants. Despite the many hardships faced along the way, including illness, starvation, and treacherous terrain, Young kept the group focused on their ultimate goal of reaching the Salt Lake Valley. His ability to motivate and encourage the Mormons in the face of adversity played a major role in their perseverance. Young's leadership was also instrumental in navigating the political landscape of the time. As the Mormons moved west, they encountered various challenges from both the U.S. government and neighboring settlers. Young worked to maintain peaceful relations with Native American tribes and sought to establish a sense of stability and governance within the Mormon community. His diplomatic skills helped the Mormons avoid some of the tensions that could have further complicated their journey. Upon arriving in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, Young made the decision to settle there, seeing it as the promised land for his people. His vision for the area was clear. He wanted to create a self-sustaining community where the Mormons could live according to their religious principles without interference. Young's leadership continued to shape the development of the Salt Lake Valley, as he organized the construction of irrigation systems, roads, and settlements that would lay the foundation for what would become the Utah Territory. Brigham Young's leadership not only ensured the survival of the Mormon community, but also laid the groundwork for its future growth and success. His ability to unite the Mormons and guide them through one of the most difficult periods in their history cemented his place as one of the most influential leaders in Mormon history. Under his leadership, the Mormons not only found a new home, but also built a thriving community that would endure for generations. His legacy as the leader who took the Mormons to the Promised Land remains a central part of Mormon history and identity. The trek across the plains. The trek across the plains was one of the most grueling and defining parts of the Mormon migration to the Salt Lake Valley. As Brigham Young led thousands of Mormons westward, the journey became a test of endurance, faith, and resilience. The group traveled in wagon trains, with each train consisting of multiple families and individuals who were determined to find a new home. The pioneers faced harsh conditions from the start, including limited resources, unpredictable weather, and rough terrain. The wagons, which were essential for transporting belongings and supplies, often proved difficult to maneuver through the challenging landscape. The journey was slow and physically demanding, with many of the emigrants ill-prepared for the hardships they would face. Along the way, there were frequent stops to rest and replenish supplies, but these breaks were not always enough to offset the difficulties the travelers encountered. The pioneers' determination to reach the Salt Lake Valley was tested time and time again as they faced obstacles such as swollen rivers, thick mud, and steep mountain passes. Despite the harsh conditions, the Mormon pioneers remained committed to their goal. The group's leadership, including Brigham Young, played a key role in maintaining morale during the difficult journey. Young's organization and decision-making abilities were crucial in ensuring the safety and well-being of the emigrants. He was constantly adjusting plans and strategies to keep the group on track, even when faced with adversity. His steady leadership gave the Mormons the confidence to continue forward, no matter how difficult the journey became. As the trek continued, many of the pioneers grew weary, and some began to suffer from illness and exhaustion. Disease, including dysentery, cholera, and other ailments, spread through the camp, taking the lives of several pioneers along the way. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and their conditions worsened as the days passed. Despite these hardships, the Mormon pioneers cared for one another, often sharing limited resources and helping those who were too weak to continue. The hardships of the journey were also compounded by the challenge of crossing rivers and mountain ranges. Many of the rivers the Mormons had to cross were swollen from recent rain, and the waters were often fast-moving and dangerous. Crossing the rivers required careful planning and coordination, as some families had to wait for the arrival of ferry boats or for conditions to improve before attempting to cross. The mountains posed their own set of challenges, with steep slopes that made wagon travel almost impossible in certain areas. As the Mormons crossed the plains, they began to see the benefits of their perseverance. The further they traveled, the more determined they became to reach their destination. The pioneers' sense of unity and purpose grew stronger as they faced each obstacle together. The journey was not just about reaching a physical destination, it was about proving their faith and commitment to creating a new home based on their religious beliefs. Each step forward was a triumph, a testament to their unwavering resolve. Finally, after months of difficult travel, the Mormon pioneers reached the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. The site of the valley, with its fertile land and protective mountains, was a welcome relief after the long and exhausting journey. The pioneers had endured much to reach this point, but the end of the trek marked the beginning of a new chapter in their history. Their arrival in the Salt Lake Valley not only marked the culmination of their trek, but also set the stage for the creation of a new Mormon society in the West. The journey across the plains became a powerful symbol of faith, endurance, and the pursuit of religious freedom. Hardships of the journey. The hardships of the Mormon migration westward were immense and unrelenting. From the moment they left Nauvoo, the Mormon pioneers faced constant challenges that tested their strength and resolve. The long journey took them through treacherous terrain, including vast plains, deep rivers, and steep mountains. As the emigrants traveled, they battled extreme weather conditions, including scorching heat and freezing cold, which made survival even more difficult. The pioneers struggled with the limited resources they had. Wagons, oxen, and horses were their primary means of transport, but they quickly wore out from the long, hard journey. Supplies, including food and water, were often in short supply. As the journey stretched on, many of the emigrants had to ration their provisions, eating what little they could and hoping to find more along the way. The scarcity of resources made each day a challenge as the pioneers moved forward. Disease spread rapidly among the Mormon emigrants, claiming the lives of many. Illnesses such as dysentery and cholera were common, especially in the unhygienic conditions of the wagon trains. The spread of disease was worsened by the lack of medical supplies and the difficulty of treating the sick while on the move. Even those who were relatively healthy faced physical exhaustion from the long days of travel and the constant demands of the journey. Many of the children and elderly were especially vulnerable to the harsh conditions. Their bodies were less able to cope with the physical demands of the journey, and many became ill or weakened by the long trek. Parents and family members often had to carry their children for long distances or help elderly relatives who were too weak to walk. The emotional toll of caring for loved ones while trying to survive in such difficult conditions was immense. The challenges of crossing rivers were another major hardship. Many of the rivers the pioneers had to ford were swollen from recent rains, and the water was swift and dangerous. Some families lost belongings, while others had to wait for days to cross, depending on the availability of ferry boats. The crossing of each river posed a risk to the safety of the pioneers, and several lives were lost in the attempt to navigate the waters. The trek also included long stretches of barren land with little to no shelter. The pioneers had to make camp in harsh environments where there was no protection from the sun, wind, or rain. The lack of food and water on these stretches made the journey even more challenging. The pioneers often had to make do with what they had, finding shelter where they could and enduring the elements until they could move on. Despite all the hardships, the Mormon pioneers pushed on, motivated by their faith and their desire to create a new home. Every step was a challenge, but their determination to reach the Salt Lake Valley never wavered. They relied on each other for support, sharing what little they had and helping one another through the difficult times. The hardships of the journey ultimately forged a strong sense of unity and perseverance within the group, and their arrival in the Salt Lake Valley marked the triumph over all the obstacles they had faced. Chapter 4: Settling the Utah Territory. After the Mormon pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, they faced the challenge of establishing a new home in the harsh environment of the Utah Territory. The area was remote and largely uninhabited, but it offered the Mormons a sense of religious freedom that they had long sought. Brigham Young, along with other church leaders, made the decision to settle in the valley, believing it would be the perfect place for the establishment of their faith-based community. The decision was not an easy one, but the promise of a new beginning motivated the pioneers to begin building their new society. The first task upon arrival was to create a self-sustaining settlement. The pioneers quickly realized that they would need to develop farming and irrigation systems to survive in the arid land. Young and the Mormon leaders had a vision for the valley, one that included widespread agriculture, thriving communities, and economic prosperity. They immediately set about organizing the construction of irrigation canals, which would later become a vital part of their ability to grow crops in the dry environment. The Mormons also had to build homes and shelters from the resources available to them. Many settlers lived in simple adobe houses or dugout homes until they were able to construct more permanent structures. The pioneers worked tirelessly to establish a basic infrastructure, including roads, schools, and a central gathering place for worship. As the community grew, the Mormons began to shape the area into a functioning settlement, focused on their religious and social ideals. One of the most significant achievements of the early settlers was the successful creation of irrigation systems. The Mormon pioneers worked together to dig miles of canals that would carry water from nearby rivers to the fields. This system not only allowed them to grow crops, but also became a symbol of their unity and determination. The success of their irrigation efforts was a crucial factor in their ability to turn the barren land into a productive and thriving agricultural region. The early settlers also faced difficulties in securing enough supplies and resources. The isolation of the Utah Territory made it difficult to obtain goods from other areas, and the Mormons had to rely on their ingenuity and resourcefulness to make do with what they had. Trading with neighboring communities and learning to grow their own food helped the Mormons establish a degree of self-sufficiency. They began to develop their own industries, such as weaving, blacksmithing, and milling, to meet their needs. Despite the difficulties they faced, the Mormon settlers persevered, driven by their faith and commitment to their new way of life. They built a community based on their religious beliefs, where church and state were closely intertwined. The practice of communal living, where resources and responsibilities were shared, became an important part of the early Mormon society. This sense of unity helped the pioneers overcome the many challenges of their new environment. By the end of the 1850s, the Salt Lake Valley had transformed from a barren wilderness into a thriving settlement. The Mormons had established a successful agricultural economy and built a foundation for further expansion in the surrounding regions. The settlement of the Utah Territory marked the beginning of a new chapter for the Mormon people, one that would continue to evolve as they spread across the western United States. Their determination, faith, and resilience played a central role in the establishment of the Mormon community in the Utah Territory. Founding Salt Lake City. The founding of Salt Lake City marked a significant milestone in the Mormon migration and settlement in the Utah Territory. When Brigham Young first arrived in the Salt Lake Valley in 1847, he declared it to be the promised land for the Mormon people. Young envisioned a thriving city, one that would serve as the center of Mormon religious and cultural life. The location, though isolated, offered fertile land, a good water supply, and natural barriers that provided some protection from outside threats. In the months that followed their arrival, Young organized the Mormon pioneers to begin laying the foundations for Salt Lake City. The settlers used basic surveying tools to map out the city, creating a grid pattern for streets that would allow for future growth. The plan was based on Young's idea of an orderly, efficient city where religious and communal life would be at the forefront. Salt Lake City's streets were designed to run east to west and north to south, allowing for easy navigation and future expansion. As the city began to take shape, the Mormons worked quickly to establish essential infrastructure. One of the first priorities was building a church building where worship services could be held. Young had a vision for Salt Lake City as a religious center, and the construction of the tabernacle and later the Salt Lake Temple would be central to that vision. The settlers also worked to establish basic services, including roads, homes, and water systems, all while maintaining a focus on religious observance. The construction of Salt Lake City's irrigation system was another key achievement. The Mormons had learned from their previous experiences in Nauvoo and other settlements that water was essential for survival and prosperity. Young directed the construction of canals and ditches that would allow the city's settlers to irrigate the surrounding land and support farming. This irrigation system would become a lifeline for the city's growing population and help turn the barren landscape into a productive agricultural region. While building the city, the pioneers faced challenges that tested their resolve. The harsh climate of the Utah Territory posed difficulties, including extreme heat during the summer and bitter cold in the winter. The settlers had to contend with limited resources and the ongoing struggle to establish a sustainable economy. Despite these hardships, the Mormons were determined to create a permanent home in the valley. Their ability to adapt and innovate played a crucial role in the success of the settlement. Salt Lake City quickly became the central hub for the Mormon community. The city's growth was fueled by the influx of more settlers who came seeking religious freedom and a new life in the West. Young and the other leaders encouraged the development of a thriving economy based on agriculture, trade, and industry. Salt Lake City began to emerge as a center of commerce and culture, with businesses, schools, and cultural institutions gradually taking shape. By the 1850s, Salt Lake City had developed into a thriving settlement and the center of the Mormon community in the West. It became the foundation for future expansion into surrounding areas and a model for the cities that would follow. The vision of Brigham Young and the hard work of the Mormon pioneers transformed a remote and desolate valley into a vibrant city. The founding of Salt Lake City marked the beginning of a new era for the Mormon people, one that would shape their future for generations to come. Irrigation and community building. Irrigation played a crucial role in the early development of Salt Lake City and the surrounding Utah territory. When the Mormon pioneers first arrived, they faced the challenge of settling in an arid environment with little natural rainfall. Brigham Young understood that for the community to thrive, they would need to harness water resources to irrigate the land and support farming. The construction of an extensive irrigation system was one of the first and most important tasks the settlers undertook. The pioneers worked together to create a network of canals and ditches that would carry water from the nearby rivers to the fields and gardens. This system allowed the settlers to grow the crops they needed to survive and build a self-sustaining community. The canals were often dug by hand, with settlers working tirelessly to ensure that water could reach every part of the valley. As the system expanded, it became a model for other settlements in the region. Irrigation became more than just a practical necessity. It became a symbol of the settlers' unity and determination. The entire community participated in the construction of the canals, reinforcing the idea of shared responsibility and cooperation. It was not just about survival, but about building something lasting and meaningful. The work was often grueling, but the settlers saw it as an essential part of their mission to create a new society in the West. As the irrigation system developed, it allowed for the growth of a thriving agricultural economy. The fertile land, once barren and unproductive, began to yield crops such as wheat, corn, and vegetables. This agricultural success provided the settlers with the food they needed and also enabled them to trade with nearby communities. The surplus of food helped Salt Lake City become a more self-sufficient settlement and strengthened the community's economic foundation. The success of irrigation also supported the growth of Salt Lake City itself. As the city expanded, so did the need for more resources and infrastructure. The canal system supported the growth of new neighborhoods and the development of essential services, such as mills, workshops, and schools. The expansion of irrigation systems was closely tied to the growth of the city, as water was needed for both residential and agricultural purposes. Community building went hand in hand with the development of the irrigation system. The Mormon settlers built their homes, schools, and places of worship with a sense of shared purpose and collective responsibility. The leaders of the church, including Brigham Young, emphasized the importance of creating a society based on cooperation, mutual aid, and faith. These principles were reflected in the daily life of the settlers, who worked together to build a strong, united community. By the mid-1850s, the combined efforts of irrigation and community building had transformed Salt Lake City into a thriving settlement. The once barren land was now home to a growing population, supported by agriculture, trade, and industry. The success of the irrigation system and the cooperative spirit of the pioneers helped solidify Salt Lake City's place as the heart of Mormon society in the West. The community had not only survived, but had begun to flourish, setting the stage for future growth and expansion. Relations with native tribes. The arrival of the Mormon pioneers in the Utah Territory brought them into contact with the Native American tribes that had long inhabited the region. Initially, the relationship between the Mormons and the native tribes was one of mutual curiosity. The Mormons were determined to establish their community in the valley, and many of the native tribes, including the Ute, Shoshone, and Paiute, were initially wary but generally peaceful. However, the settlers' arrival disrupted the delicate balance that the native tribes had maintained for centuries, leading to tensions that would grow over time. Brigham Young, aware of the importance of good relations with the native tribes, attempted to approach them diplomatically. He emphasized the need for peace and cooperation and sought to establish trade relations with the native groups. The Mormons traded goods such as livestock and tools in exchange for food and other resources, and at first some of the tribes were receptive to these exchanges. The Mormon leaders even sought to convert Native Americans to their faith, believing that the teachings of their religion would benefit the native tribes. Despite the Mormons' efforts to build peaceful relations, the settlers' increasing presence and expansion into native lands caused friction. The construction of homes, irrigation systems, and farms encroached on traditional native hunting grounds, leading to disputes over territory. As more settlers arrived, the land that had once been freely roamed by the native tribes became divided and occupied, which increased the tension between the two groups. Over time, misunderstandings and frustrations grew on both sides. In some cases, the Mormons resorted to more aggressive tactics to deal with native resistance. The settlers sometimes viewed the native tribes as a threat to their safety and livelihood, leading to acts of violence and retaliation. Conflicts over land, resources, and the spread of disease further soured relations. The Mormons, like other settlers, struggled to navigate the complexities of their presence in a region where Native Americans had lived for generations. However, there were also instances of cooperation and peaceful interactions. Some native groups formed alliances with the Mormon settlers, offering assistance in times of need. For example, the Mormon settlers relied on the knowledge of native tribes to navigate the difficult terrain and survive in the harsh conditions of the Utah Territory. In certain areas, Mormons and native tribes lived side by side, with some intermarriages occurring between the groups, helping to bridge cultural gaps and establish a semblance of peace. The tensions between the Mormons and the native tribes culminated in several violent confrontations. One of the most notable incidents was the Mountain Meadows Massacre in 1857, where a group of Mormon settlers, fearing attack from Native American tribes, killed a group of emigrants passing through the region. While the massacre is often seen as an act of self-defense, it is also an example of how mistrust and fear between the two groups led to tragic outcomes. The massacre strained Mormon relations with both Native Americans and other settlers in the region. Over time, the Mormons' presence in Utah continued to grow, and relations with the native tribes became more complex. While some tribes adapted to the changing landscape and sought to coexist with the settlers, others resisted, leading to ongoing conflicts. The Mormon leadership, particularly Brigham Young, continued to advocate for peace where possible, but the growth of the settlement and the pressure on native lands made lasting harmony difficult to achieve. The story of Mormon-native relations in the Utah Territory is one of both cooperation and conflict, shaped by the complex dynamics of westward expansion and cultural clash. Chapter 5: Ongoing Hostilities. The tensions between the Mormon settlers and Native American tribes in the Utah Territory continued to escalate after the initial settlement. As more settlers arrived and the community expanded, competition for land and resources intensified. The Mormons' growing presence disrupted the native tribes' way of life, leading to more frequent confrontations over territory, hunting grounds, and water resources. This growing hostility was compounded by the Mormons' attempts to convert Native Americans to their faith, which some tribes viewed as a form of cultural invasion. Brigham Young's attempts to maintain peace between the Mormons and the native tribes became increasingly difficult as tensions rose. Young initially sought to establish cooperative relationships, but as the settlers' needs grew, he struggled to prevent conflicts from escalating. Some Mormon leaders took matters into their own hands, encouraging defensive actions to protect their settlements. These actions sometimes resulted in violent clashes with native groups, further straining relations and fostering mutual distrust. The Mormon settlers' fear of Native American attacks played a significant role in the ongoing hostilities. The settlers often viewed the native tribes as potential threats, even though many of the native groups had no intention of attacking. The Mormons' defensive mindset led them to take preemptive actions, such as building forts and stockades for protection. This defensive posture only increased the tension, as the native tribes often interpreted these actions as acts of aggression. In addition to territorial disputes, the Mormons' growing economic influence in the region added another layer of conflict. The Mormon settlers controlled much of the agricultural production in the valley, which made them an economic powerhouse in the area. The native tribes, who relied on hunting and gathering, were increasingly marginalized as the settlers monopolized the land and water resources. This economic disparity fueled resentment and led to more frequent skirmishes between the two groups. Despite these ongoing hostilities, there were occasional instances of cooperation between the Mormons and the native tribes. Some native groups, such as the Ute, were willing to trade with the settlers and even offer their assistance in times of need. However, these moments of peace were often short-lived, as the underlying tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface. The constant struggle for control over land and resources made it difficult for lasting cooperation to take root. One of the most significant events during this period of ongoing hostilities was the Walker War of 1853 to 1854. The conflict was sparked by a series of confrontations between the Mormons and the Timpanogits, a subgroup of the Ute tribe. The war resulted in several violent clashes, with both sides suffering casualties. The war ended with a peace treaty, but it left deep scars in the relationship between the Mormons and the native tribes in the region. By the end of the 1850s, the ongoing hostilities between the Mormons and the native tribes had become a defining feature of life in the Utah Territory. While some groups managed to coexist, others remained locked in conflict. The Mormons' expansion in the region continued to disrupt the native way of life, and the settlers' fear of attacks led to a cycle of violence and mistrust. This period of ongoing hostilities marked a difficult chapter in the history of the Mormon settlement, with the tensions between the two groups continuing to shape the future of the Utah Territory. The Utah War. The Utah War, which began in 1857, was a significant conflict between the United States government and the Mormon settlers in the Utah Territory. Tensions had been building for years due to the Mormon community's increasing independence and their resistance to federal control. The Mormons, under the leadership of Brigham Young, had established a theocratic government that operated largely outside the authority of the U.S. government. This, combined with the Mormons' isolationist tendencies, alarmed federal authorities, who saw it as a threat to the Union. The conflict was triggered when President James Buchanan sent a military expedition to Utah, ostensibly to address concerns over the Mormons' rebellion against federal authority. Buchanan appointed a new territorial governor, Alfred Cumming, to replace Brigham Young, but the Mormons viewed this as an unwelcome intrusion into their affairs. Brigham Young and the Mormon leadership refused to recognize Cumming's authority, escalating the situation. The U.S. government, fearing an armed uprising, ordered the military to march toward Utah to assert control. As federal troops made their way to Utah, Brigham Young declared martial law in the territory, preparing for a potential confrontation. Young and the Mormon leaders took steps to fortify Salt Lake City, constructing defensive structures and organizing the local militia. The Mormons feared that the federal government would not only replace their leadership, but also undermine their religious freedom and territorial claims. The arrival of federal troops seemed inevitable, and the Mormons were determined to defend their territory. The early stages of the war were marked by a tense standoff, with both sides preparing for battle. The Mormon militia, known as the Nauvoo Legion, conducted a series of skirmishes with federal troops, but neither side wanted to escalate the conflict into full-scale warfare. The Mormons, however, continued to fortify their positions and prepare for what they believed would be an inevitable clash. At the same time, the federal government was reluctant to send large numbers of troops into the area, as the situation was still uncertain. In the winter of 1857 to 1858, the situation reached a boiling point when the Mormon militia began to harass federal troops, attacking supply trains and delaying their progress. These actions were part of a larger strategy by Young and the Mormon leadership to prevent the federal forces from reaching Salt Lake City. The Mormons burned supplies and blocked roads, hoping to wear down the federal forces and force a retreat. The federal troops, ill-prepared for the harsh winter conditions and increasingly isolated, began to suffer significant hardships. By the spring of 1858, the conflict had begun to fizzle out as both sides realized the cost of continuing the war. President Buchanan, seeking a peaceful resolution, ordered a ceasefire and sent a peace commission to negotiate with the Mormons. Brigham Young, recognizing the need to avoid further bloodshed, agreed to the terms of a truce. The U.S. government decided to send a new governor, Alfred Cumming, to Utah, and in return, Brigham Young and the Mormons were allowed to maintain control of their land and religious practices. The Utah War ended without a major battle, but it had lasting consequences for the Mormon community. While they had successfully defended their territory, the war left them more isolated and distrustful of the U.S. government. It also strained relations with neighboring states, who were sympathetic to the federal cause. In the years that followed, the Mormons continued to build their society in the Utah Territory, but the scars of the Utah War remained, shaping their relationship with the federal government for decades to come. Government intervention. The government's intervention in Utah during the mid-1800s was largely a response to the growing concerns over the Mormon community's independence and its defiance of federal authority. The Mormons had established a theocratic system under Brigham Young's leadership, which alarmed the U.S. government. Many viewed the Mormons as a challenge to the Union, as they governed the Utah Territory with little regard for federal laws or oversight. The government, particularly under President James Buchanan, felt it was crucial to assert control over the region to maintain order and protect American interests in the West. In 1857, President Buchanan took decisive action by sending a military expedition to Utah, which became known as the Utah War. Buchanan's government appointed a new territorial governor, Alfred Cumming, to replace Brigham Young, who had been acting as both the religious and political leader of the Mormons. This move was seen by the Mormons as an affront to their religious freedom and self-governance. Buchanan's decision was based on reports of Mormon defiance and resistance to federal authority, along with concerns about their isolated position in the West. The federal government's intervention was not limited to military action. Buchanan's administration also sought to exert political control by removing Brigham Young from his position as governor, replacing him with a more compliant official. The appointment of Cumming was part of a larger effort to install federal appointees in key positions of power in Utah. This intervention was perceived as an attempt by the U.S. government to impose its authority on the Mormon community and undermine their way of life. When the Mormon leadership resisted the new federal governor, the government took further steps to assert its control. Federal troops were sent to Utah, and Brigham Young declared martial law in response, preparing for potential conflict. The standoff between the Mormon settlers and the federal government became increasingly tense, and both sides took defensive measures. While the Mormons fortified Salt Lake City and prepared for battle, the federal government faced logistical challenges in maintaining a large military presence in the region. Despite the mounting tensions, the federal government sought to avoid a full-scale military confrontation. The harsh conditions of the Utah Territory during the winter of 1857 to 1858, combined with the Mormons' resistance tactics, made the situation untenable for both sides. In an attempt to resolve the conflict peacefully, President Buchanan sent a peace commission to negotiate with Brigham Young. The negotiations ultimately resulted in a truce, with the federal government agreeing to allow the Mormons to maintain control of their religious and political institutions in exchange for the Mormons accepting the appointment of the new governor. The intervention by the U.S. government had a lasting impact on the relationship between the Mormons and the federal authorities. Though the immediate conflict was resolved, the Mormons' distrust of the federal government deepened. The Mormons viewed the intervention as an infringement on their religious freedoms and self-determination. This sentiment persisted for years, influencing the Mormon community's interactions with the U.S. government and shaping their policies in the years following the Utah War. In the aftermath of the government intervention, the Mormons focused on rebuilding their society in the Utah Territory. While they had successfully defended their right to govern themselves, the federal government's presence in the region continued to be a source of tension. Over time, the Mormons were forced to navigate a delicate balance between maintaining their independence and complying with federal laws. The government's intervention in Utah marked a pivotal moment in the history of the Mormon community, highlighting the challenges of balancing religious autonomy with the demands of a growing nation. Anti-polygamy laws. Anti-polygamy laws became a significant point of contention between the Mormon community and the U.S. government during the late 1800s. The Mormon practice of polygamy, where men could marry multiple wives, was central to their religious beliefs. The U.S. government viewed polygamy as morally unacceptable and a direct challenge to the values of mainstream American society. As a result, anti-polygamy laws were enacted with the goal of eradicating the practice and bringing the Mormon community into compliance with federal norms. The federal government's opposition to polygamy intensified after the 1860s, when the Mormons' influence in the Utah Territory grew. In 1862, the first major federal law targeting polygamy was passed, known as the Morrill Anti-Bigamy Act. This law made it illegal for any person to practice polygamy or cohabit with multiple partners. The law specifically targeted the Mormons, who were seen as practicing a form of marriage that was incompatible with American family structures. Despite the federal government's attempts to curtail polygamy, the Mormons continued the practice, arguing that it was a divine commandment. Brigham Young and other Mormon leaders publicly defended polygamy, claiming that it was essential to their faith and that it was sanctioned by God. For the Mormons, polygamy was not only a religious tenet, but also a means of building a strong, supportive community. The continued practice of polygamy in the face of federal laws created a growing rift between the Mormon community and the U.S. government. In 1874, the U.S. government passed the Poland Act, which gave the federal government greater control over the legal and judicial systems in Utah. This law targeted Mormon leaders, giving the government the authority to prosecute them for practicing polygamy. The government's increasing crackdown on polygamy was seen by many Mormons as an attack on their religious freedom and autonomy. The legal battles and arrests of prominent Mormon figures escalated tensions and created an atmosphere of fear within the Mormon community. By the late 1880s, the U.S. government intensified its efforts to eliminate polygamy in the Utah Territory. In 1882, the Edmunds Act was passed, which made polygamy a felony and disenfranchised Mormons who practiced it. The law also stripped the right to vote from those who were involved in polygamous marriages, further isolating the Mormon community from the broader American society. The anti-polygamy laws were viewed by the federal government as a way to break the power of the Mormon Church and force the community to conform to mainstream societal norms. As the legal pressure mounted, the Mormon Church was forced to reconsider its position on polygamy. In 1890, under the leadership of President Wilford Woodruff, the Church officially issued the Manifesto, which renounced the practice of polygamy. The decision to abandon polygamy was seen by many as a necessary step for the survival of the Mormon community in the face of overwhelming legal and social pressure. However, the decision was not universally accepted, and some factions of the church continued to practice polygamy in secret. The impact of the anti-polygamy laws on the Mormon community was profound. While the formal renunciation of polygamy helped to alleviate some of the legal pressures, it did not immediately restore full peace between the Mormons and the U.S. government. Polygamy remained a controversial issue, and some Mormons resisted the church's decision, believing that abandoning the practice was a betrayal of their faith. Nonetheless, the government's crackdown on polygamy marked a turning point in the relationship between the Mormon community and the federal government, shaping the trajectory of Mormonism in America for years to come. Chapter 6: Building a New Society. The Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory marked the beginning of their efforts to build a new society, distinct from the rest of the United States. As the community grew, the Mormons worked to create a society based on their religious values, with a strong emphasis on self-reliance and cooperation. Brigham Young led the efforts to establish a thriving agricultural economy and a strong social structure that would support the needs of the growing population. The community's focus on unity and collective effort helped them overcome the many challenges they faced in the early years of settlement. Salt Lake City became the center of this new society, with its streets and infrastructure designed to reflect Mormon principles. The Mormons carefully planned the city's layout, organizing it into blocks and streets that reflected the organization and orderliness of their faith. This attention to detail extended to other aspects of life, including the establishment of schools, churches, and a system of social services. The goal was to create a self-sustaining society that could thrive in the harsh conditions of the Utah Territory while remaining true to Mormon teachings. One of the primary ways the Mormons built their society was through agriculture. Brigham Young encouraged the settlers to focus on cultivating the land to provide food and resources for their growing community. The Mormons' success in developing irrigation systems was crucial to their ability to farm in the arid desert environment. The construction of dams, canals, and irrigation ditches allowed them to cultivate crops and sustain their settlements, helping to ensure their survival in an unforgiving landscape. In addition to agriculture, the Mormons worked to establish a strong economy based on industry and trade. They sought to be self-sufficient, producing their own goods and services rather than relying on imports from outside the territory. The Mormons established numerous businesses, including mills, factories, and workshops, to support their economic needs. This industrial focus allowed the community to grow and prosper, while remaining largely independent from the U.S. government and surrounding territories. Education played an important role in the Mormons' efforts to build a new society. The community placed a high value on learning, with schools and educational institutions being established in the early years of settlement. The Mormon Church also emphasized religious education, teaching both children and adults the principles of the faith. This focus on education helped to instill a sense of unity and purpose among the members of the community, ensuring that future generations would continue to uphold the values of the Mormon society. Social structure within the Mormon community was organized around the principles of cooperation, mutual support, and family life. The Mormons believed in the importance of strong family units and sought to create a society where families could thrive. The practice of polygamy, although increasingly controversial, was also a part of this social structure, as it allowed for the growth of large families that contributed to the community's strength. The Mormon leadership played a central role in guiding the community, providing direction and support to ensure its success. By the late 1800s, the Mormon community in Utah had established a strong, thriving society that was largely self-sufficient and resilient. Despite the challenges posed by the harsh environment and external pressures, the Mormons had succeeded in creating a society based on their religious and social ideals. This new society would continue to evolve, but its foundation in faith, cooperation, and self-reliance remained a core element of its identity. The Mormons had successfully built a new society in the Utah Territory, one that would endure for generations to come. The role of religion in governance. In the early years of Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory, religion played a central role in the governance of the community. Brigham Young, as both the religious and political leader, combined the functions of a prophet and a governor. This dual role allowed him to guide both the spiritual and temporal aspects of life in the settlement. The Mormon Church's organizational structure provided a framework for governance, with the leadership of the church influencing decisions on matters ranging from legal disputes to the distribution of resources. The intertwining of religion and governance was rooted in the belief that the Mormon Church was divinely inspired to lead the people. The Church's teachings were seen as the ultimate source of authority, and laws were often based on religious principles. In this system, religious leaders held significant power, and the community was expected to adhere to the teachings of the Church in all aspects of life. This integration of faith and politics was both a unifying force and a source of tension with the outside world, particularly the U.S. government. Theocratic governance was a fundamental aspect of the Mormon way of life. Brigham Young's leadership in both spiritual and political matters helped maintain order and unity in a community that was isolated from the rest of the nation. The centralization of power in the hands of religious leaders allowed for more efficient decision-making and enforcement of church doctrine. However, this system also led to conflict with the U.S. government, which viewed the concentration of power in religious hands as a challenge to federal authority and secular governance. As the Mormon community grew, the role of religion in governance began to evolve. While the Church continued to hold significant sway over political matters, the increasing complexity of the community's interactions with the outside world necessitated some separation between the Church and the state. Nonetheless, many of the laws and policies adopted in the Utah Territory were influenced by religious teachings. This close relationship between religion and governance remained a defining feature of Mormon society throughout the 19th century. Over time, the U.S. government's attempts to curtail the power of the Church led to significant changes in how religion influenced governance. With the passage of anti-polygamy laws and other federal interventions, the Mormon leadership was forced to reconsider the extent of religious authority in public affairs. While the relationship between church and state would eventually be redefined, the legacy of theocratic governance remained an important part of Mormon history, shaping the community's identity for generations. The Perpetual Emigration Fund. The Perpetual Emigration Fund was established by the Mormon Church in 1849 to assist impoverished members of the faith in migrating to the Utah Territory. The idea behind the fund was to help Mormons who could not afford the costs of the journey to the West, where they could build a new life in accordance with their religious beliefs. Brigham Young and other church leaders saw the fund as a way to fulfill their mission of gathering the saints to a central place of refuge. It became a vital resource for thousands of Mormons looking to escape persecution and find safety in the West. The fund operated by offering loans to emigrants, allowing them to travel to Utah without needing to pay up front. The loans were to be repaid after the individuals arrived in the Utah Territory, and many recipients worked to repay their debts through labor once they settled. The goal was to ensure that every Mormon, regardless of their financial situation, could make the journey. The fund became an essential mechanism for the growth of the Mormon community in Utah during the mid-1800s. The Perpetual Emigration Fund helped thousands of Mormons reach Utah, but it was not without its challenges. The costs of emigration were high, and the fund often faced financial difficulties. The logistics of moving large groups of people across the country in the 19th century posed significant challenges, and the church had to carefully manage the funds to ensure that they were used efficiently. Despite these obstacles, the fund was seen as a success, helping to bring thousands of new settlers to Utah. The fund not only provided financial support but also fostered a sense of unity and shared purpose among the Mormon community. The idea that members of the faith would help one another, even across vast distances, strengthened the bonds of solidarity among the saints. It also reinforced the idea of the Mormon migration as a collective effort, with every person contributing to the success of the journey in their own way. This sense of community was vital in the harsh and unforgiving conditions of the Western frontier. By the late 1800s, the Perpetual Emigration Fund began to decline as fewer emigrants needed financial assistance. The fund's original purpose had been fulfilled, and by the 20th century, the focus of Mormon migration had shifted to other means of settling the region. Despite this, the legacy of the Perpetual Emigration Fund lives on in the history of the Mormon migration to Utah. It remains a testament to the faith and determination of the Mormon community in overcoming adversity and creating a thriving society in the West. Social and economic organization. The social and economic organization of the Mormon community in Utah was deeply intertwined with the values of cooperation, self-reliance, and communal support. In the early years, the Mormon settlers faced numerous challenges, and their ability to work together was critical to their survival. The concept of unity was central to their efforts, as they believed that through cooperation, they could create a society that reflected their religious ideals. This focus on collective well-being helped to shape the way they organized both their social structure and their economy. One of the key aspects of the Mormon social structure was the emphasis on the family unit. Families were seen as the foundation of both the church and the community, and much of the social organization was designed to support family life. Religious teachings reinforced the importance of strong family ties, and many aspects of daily life were centered around the home and family activities. In addition to the family, the Mormon community was organized into smaller groups, or wards, which provided both spiritual and social support to members. Economically, the Mormon community was built around a system of self-sufficiency. The church encouraged settlers to grow their own food, establish industries, and become less reliant on outside sources. Agriculture was the primary economic activity, and the Mormons developed an intricate system of irrigation to make farming viable in the arid landscape of Utah. This emphasis on local production allowed the Mormon community to thrive in an otherwise harsh environment, reducing the need for trade with outsiders and strengthening their sense of independence. The church also played a significant role in the economic organization of the community. It established a tithing system where members contributed a portion of their income to the church, which was then used to fund various community projects, including infrastructure development and charity work. This system helped ensure that resources were distributed according to need, creating a sense of shared responsibility. The church also supported the establishment of businesses and industries that could serve the community, further strengthening the local economy. By the late 1800s, the Mormon community had built a stable social and economic system that allowed them to thrive in the Utah Territory. Their focus on cooperation, self-sufficiency, and communal support had helped them overcome the challenges of settlement. The church continued to play a central role in both the social and economic life of the community, guiding the growth of Salt Lake City and other Mormon settlements. This system, while evolving over time, remained a testament to the enduring strength of the Mormon community and its ability to adapt and thrive in a challenging environment. Chapter 7: Legacy of the Pioneer Spirit. The legacy of the Mormon pioneers is deeply rooted in the courage and determination they displayed while building a new life in the Utah Territory. The struggles they faced, from harsh weather conditions to conflicts with external forces, shaped a unique spirit of resilience that became the foundation of their community. This pioneer spirit was not only about surviving in a difficult environment, but also about establishing a society based on shared values and beliefs. The determination to build something lasting in the face of adversity continues to inspire future generations. The pioneering efforts of the Mormons in the West also left a lasting impact on the American landscape and history. The settlers contributed to the development of the western frontier, helping to expand the United States territory through their settlement and hard work. Salt Lake City, founded by Brigham Young and his followers, grew into a thriving metropolis, serving as a symbol of what could be achieved through determination and faith. The Mormon community's success in transforming the harsh desert into a fertile land for agriculture and settlement stands as a testament to their pioneering efforts. Their contributions to agriculture, infrastructure, and community organization set the stage for future generations of Mormons and other settlers in the region. The extensive irrigation systems developed by the Mormons were a significant innovation that helped the region thrive. Additionally, the sense of self-reliance and community cooperation that characterized Mormon society in the 19th century continues to shape the culture of the area today. The pioneering spirit instilled by those early settlers still influences the values and ideals of the people in the region. While the legacy of the pioneers is often celebrated for its achievements in settlement and survival, it also raises questions about the interactions with Native American tribes and the impact of Mormon expansion on indigenous populations. Tensions between the settlers and Native American tribes were a part of the early history of the region, and these interactions have left a complicated legacy. The Mormon pioneers, like other settler groups, were part of a broader pattern of displacement and change that affected the native peoples of the West. Today, the legacy of the Mormon pioneers continues to shape the identity of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the state of Utah. The courage, faith, and perseverance of the early settlers are remembered and honored by those who follow in their footsteps. The pioneer spirit lives on in the stories told within families, communities, and religious institutions. It serves as a reminder of the sacrifices made and the vision that helped create the foundation of the modern Mormon community in the West. Statehood and modernization. The path to statehood for Utah was long and challenging, shaped by both the Mormon community's growth and its ongoing conflict with the U.S. government. After years of tension and negotiations, Utah officially became a state in 1896, nearly 50 years after the first Mormon pioneers settled in the region. The struggle for statehood was marked by the need to resolve issues like polygamy, which was practiced by many early Mormons, and the desire for greater political autonomy. The Mormon Church played a significant role in both the political and social aspects of the state's development, ensuring that the faith's influence remained strong even as the region modernized. Once Utah achieved statehood, the region began to experience significant changes. The economy, which had been based largely on agriculture and self-sufficiency, began to diversify with the introduction of industries like mining, railroads, and manufacturing. These developments brought new opportunities for the people of Utah, but also posed challenges as the state adapted to the demands of modernization. The population of Salt Lake City grew rapidly, becoming a bustling urban center that reflected the state's transition into the modern era. The Mormon Church's influence continued to shape Utah's development during this time, though it had to navigate the increasing pressure to adapt to mainstream American values. The decline of polygamy, driven by both legal restrictions and changes within the church, marked a turning point in the relationship between the state and the federal government. As Utah embraced modernization, the church's leadership worked to ensure that religious practices aligned with the broader expectations of American society, helping to smooth the transition into statehood and reduce the stigma attached to Mormonism. Modernization in Utah also brought changes to social and cultural life. The influx of non-Mormon settlers, as well as the growth of industrialization, led to a more diverse society. While the Mormon community continued to play a dominant role, new ideas and influences began to shape the state's culture. Education, healthcare, and infrastructure all improved as the state modernized, and Utah became more integrated into the national economy and political system. Today, the legacy of Utah's journey to statehood and its subsequent modernization is reflected in the state's thriving economy, diverse population, and rich cultural heritage. The balance between maintaining Mormon traditions and embracing modernity continues to define the state. From agriculture to technology, Utah has become a state known for its resilience and adaptability, much like the pioneers who first settled the land. The story of Utah's statehood and modernization is a testament to the ongoing evolution of a community that once faced immense challenges and transformed them into lasting achievements. Cultural preservation. Cultural preservation has been a key focus for the Mormon community throughout its history, particularly in Utah. The settlers understood the importance of maintaining their religious beliefs, practices, and traditions, even as they adapted to life in the new territory. The early pioneers worked hard to ensure that their culture would thrive in the West, despite the challenges they faced. Over time, the preservation of their heritage became not only a religious duty, but also a way to solidify their identity in a growing and increasingly diverse society. The Mormon Church has played a central role in cultural preservation, ensuring that religious teachings and practices remain intact for future generations. The establishment of institutions like Brigham Young University and various cultural centers has helped to pass down the faith's traditions and history. The Church has also encouraged the preservation of sacred sites, such as the Salt Lake Temple and the historic sites associated with the pioneer journey. These landmarks serve as both physical reminders of the past and active centers for the practice of faith. Alongside religious preservation, the Mormon community has worked to safeguard cultural practices, such as the use of music, art, and storytelling. Mormon pioneers brought with them rich traditions of hymn singing, art creation, and oral storytelling, all of which have remained significant in the community. These cultural practices continue to play an important role in both worship and community life. The Church encourages these artistic expressions as a means of connecting with the past while adapting them to modern contexts. In addition to religious and cultural practices, the Mormon community has focused on preserving its historical narrative. The stories of the early pioneers, including the hardships they faced and their resilience, are integral to the identity of modern Mormons. Efforts to document and share these stories through museums, books, and educational programs have helped keep the history of the Mormon migration alive. This storytelling tradition continues to bind the community together, fostering a shared sense of purpose and history. The preservation of Mormon culture is not only about maintaining the past, but also about adapting it to the future. As Utah has modernized and become more diverse, the Mormon community has worked to balance tradition with the need to integrate into a changing world. The ongoing efforts to preserve cultural identity while embracing new ideas and innovations reflect the resilience of the Mormon people and their commitment to their heritage. Through these efforts, the pioneer spirit continues to shape the future of the community, ensuring that the culture remains vibrant and relevant in the modern age.